Hello, friends. How was your day? Welcome to Soft History Stories. Today, we're going to tell you true stories about dating during Victoria era. There are hardly any romantic marriages. There are only marriages of convenience. London, 1857. The city is soaked in rain and secrets. Carriage wheels murmur along the cobblestones, their echoes weaving through the mist like a tired lullaby. The lamps burn dimly, halos of amber blurring in the fog, while behind a curtained window on Brook Street, a young woman stands still before a mirror that has seen too many sighs. Her mother, severe but loving in that peculiarly Victorian way, adjusts the folds of her daughter's gown and murmurs the evening's final lesson. Remember, dear, never show eagerness. Men admire restraint more than beauty. Ah, you can almost hear the corset groan in protest as ribbons tighten and the air itself seems to thin. The girl nods not out of agreement, but because there is no alternative. Love, in her world, is not something one falls into. It is something one performs, rehearsed to perfection beneath chandeliers and scrutiny. Somewhere outside, the rain continues its patient tapping on the glass, as if to remind her that even the sky weeps more freely than she can. This was Victorian romance, not a fever, not a thunderstorm, but a ceremony. It was less about hearts and more about choreography, less about feeling and more about form. There were rules to every glance, hidden meanings in every word, and an entire code of gestures more binding than law. A misplaced smile could brand you wanton. A letter without a seal could invite ruin. Courtship wasn't about spontaneity, it was about survival, wrapped neatly in lace and lavender. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might almost hear it, the delicate clinking of teacups, the whisper of skirts brushing over polished floors, the faint scratch of a pen writing words that would never be read aloud. The language of love was a symphony of restraint. Even making love didn't mean what you think it did. It meant talking, complimenting, admiring, all under the watchful eyes of mothers, aunts, and moralists, armed with fans and judgment. You see, in the age of Queen Victoria, affection was a dangerous luxury. Desire was fine, so long as it was invisible. Society demanded purity, but it also demanded performance, a contradiction that every woman had to master if she wished to live respectably. A fluttered heartbeat was not to be felt. It was to be hidden behind a polite smile and a perfect curtsy. And the men, poor creatures, were no freer. They courted with caution, measured every word, and feared scandal more than heartbreak. So tonight, we will slip quietly into that world, into the gaslight and the gloom, the perfumes and the politeness, the quiet ache that simmered beneath all that restraint. Let the sound of rain soften the edges of your thoughts. Imagine the lace gloves, the trembling teacup, the shy glance over porcelain rims. For all its decorum, there was still longing there, the same restless heartbeat that hums in us now, only muffled beneath crinoline and candlelight. Get comfortable, my friend. Dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, tea if you're proper, cocoa if you're honest. Tonight, we're not swiping right, we're curtsying left. We're drifting back to a time when falling in love required not just courage, but choreography, when every heartbeat had to be hidden under silk, and every word of affection had to pass through a gatekeeper called etiquette. And if you're still awake by the end, perhaps you'll agree love may have worn tighter corsets back then, but the longing beneath them was just as human, just as foolish, and just as beautifully inevitable. It begins quietly, as all things respectable must, not with a confession or a kiss, but with a calling card. A small rectangle of cream-colored paper, engraved with a name and nothing more, placed on a silver tray by a servant's hand. It might rest there for days, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be returned. That, in essence, was how Victorian love began. Not with spontaneity, but with stationery. Romance did not bloom like a wildflower in this era. It was cultivated in greenhouses, pruned, supervised, and only allowed to exist if it followed the proper sequence of social seasons. The Victorians adored order. and nowhere was that order more suffocating than in matters of the heart. There were visiting hours, calling days, chaperones, and curfews. There was even a correct distance at which two people could stand during conversation close enough to hear each other's voices, but far enough that one's sleeve could not brush against another's glove. Every rule was a thread in the larger tapestry of morality, woven so tightly that even a misplaced glance could unravel it. It wasn't enough to feel affection. One had to express it with elegance, under the surveillance of society itself. Imagine, if you will, a London drawing room bathed in afternoon light. The air smells faintly of coal and lavender water. A piano plays somewhere down the corridor, not to entertain, but to fill the silence left by too much propriety. A young lady, perhaps 17 or 18, sits beside her mother, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes trained on the window as if afraid to look directly at the guest before her. The gentleman, recently introduced, has been granted precisely 15 minutes for this visit, no more. His speech must be civil, his tone respectful, his admiration subtle enough to pass as politeness. Anything warmer would be indecent, anything colder, insulting. Love, in the Victorian world, was not a feeling, it was choreography. Each movement, from the lowering of the gaze to the turning of a teacup, was part of a ritual understood by all and enjoyed by none. And yet, beneath the stiffness of manners, something still stirred that fragile, forbidden pulse of humanity that no etiquette manual could quite extinguish. It's almost comforting, isn't it, to know that even in an age of lace and restraint, people still found ways to fall in love, if only between commas and curtsies. The Victorians turned romance into performance because emotion frightened them. Feeling too much was considered vulgar. To lose composure was to lose control, and control was the foundation of civilization. The heart had to obey the mind, or else society itself would crumble into chaos, or so the sermons warned. So they built barriers around tenderness, layers of etiquette, religion, and ritual, until affection looked almost indistinguishable from indifference. A lady could not write first, could not visit uninvited, could not even smile too freely without risking whispers of impropriety. Her reputation was her only inheritance, and one wrong expression could bankrupt her completely. Men were not much freer, for chivalry was its own kind of prison. They were taught to conceal longing behind wit, to translate affection into compliments about weather and wallpaper, to never confess desire outright. A gentleman who appeared too forward risked ruin just as surely as the woman he admired. And so, both sexes circled each other endlessly, two actors in a social play written by their ancestors, bound by invisible strings of convention that neither dared to cut. There was an entire vocabulary of gesture, too subtle for modern eyes to notice. A dropped glove could be an invitation, a fan held to the cheek, a rejection. A letter folded once meant friendship, twice meant affection, 3 times meant something dangerously close to passion. People spent years learning this silent language, all while pretending not to speak it. How exhausting it must have been to want someone and yet have to encode that desire into the angle of a bow or the tilt of a hat. But perhaps the most fragile part of this dance was its audience. Nothing in the Victorian world happened in private, least of all, love. The moment a young woman began to receive regular visits from a man, her friends, her family, even the servants would begin to speculate. Was he serious? Was she too eager? Had the mother pushed it? Gossip traveled faster than carriages, and reputation, that brittle, gleaming currency, could be spent in an instant. It wasn't the loss of love one feared most, but the loss of face. If you're still awake, imagine how heavy the air must have felt at those evening gatherings. The drawing room filled with people pretending not to notice one another, conversations about music disguising the tremors of emotion underneath. Each gesture was calculated, every laugh rehearsed, every pause between sentences measured with the precision of a watchmaker. It was theater, yes, but it was also survival. The ability to conceal one's true feelings was considered a mark of breeding, as vital as knowing how to waltz or pour tea. And yet, despite all the rules, or perhaps because of them, love found ways to thrive. It hid in metaphors, it lingered in eye contact that lasted a heartbeat too long, it clung to letters written in invisible ink and delivered by trusted maids. It lived in the stolen seconds between supervision and suspicion. That was the great paradox of Victorian affection. The more it was forbidden, the more precious it became. The danger sharpened its sweetness. The silence made its voice louder in the imagination. There's something oddly beautiful about that, don't you think? That people who could barely touch hands still managed to touch hearts. That under the suffocating weight of propriety, emotion didn't die, it learned to disguise itself. Perhaps it even grew stronger for having to hide. Maybe that's what love truly was in that age. Not the grand declarations of novels, but the quiet endurance of those who felt deeply while pretending not to. By the time the fire burned low and the last guest departed, the young woman in the drawing room would finally exhale. Her gloves would come off, her corset loosened, and for the first time that day she could breathe, though never quite freely. Somewhere on the table lay a calling card, faintly scented with cologne, its edges damp from the humidity of nervous fingers. It meant nothing, officially. It meant everything, secretly. And as she turned it over in her hand, she might wonder, just for a moment, whether he would call again, whether this elaborate ritual of politeness could, against all odds, become something real. But that question, like all others in her world, would have to wait until morning. Because in the Victorian age, even longing had a schedule, and love, poor, patient love, always arrived on time, dressed properly, and never, ever unchaperoned. If love was a ceremony, then making love was its most misunderstood ritual. Today, the phrase conjures images of intimacy, of unrestrained closeness between two people. But in the parlors and drawing rooms of Victorian England, it meant something entirely different. Making love was talking. It was conversation, not passion, but performance. It was a carefully orchestrated duet of words, glances, and pauses, designed to hint at affection without ever declaring it. In an era where desire had to hide behind decorum, language became both weapon and refuge. A Victorian gentleman made love, not with his hands but with his adjectives. His charm was measured not in touch, but in tone. He might lean forward just slightly, complimenting a lady on her needlework, her piano playing, or the restraint of her fashion, because restraint itself was beauty in this age. The weather seems unusually soft today, he might say. And what he truly meant was, I think of you more often than I should. The flowers in your garden are thriving. Might translate to, I am losing sleep over your smile. Everything was wrapped in metaphor, delicate as lace, deliberate as chess. But the game was not without danger. One misplaced word could undo weeks of careful progress. A compliment too bold, your eyes are lovely, could be considered scandalous, while one too tepid, your father's lawn is well maintained, could doom a courtship entirely. The art was in finding the perfect balance, warm enough to stir curiosity, proper enough to pass parental inspection. It was a balancing act performed beneath chandeliers, over teacups, and always within earshot of at least one older woman whose job was to guard virtue like a fortress gate. Imagine them now, our two would-be lovers, seated at opposite ends of a parlor, the air thick with perfume and politeness. A piano murmurs in the background, played by a cousin pretending not to listen. The gentleman chooses his opening line with the precision of a duelist. The lady answers with a smile so faint it could be mistaken for fatigue. He quotes a poet, Byron or Tennyson, depending on her family's moral temperature. She counters with a reference to flowers or art or scripture. Between them, something delicate takes shape, a bridge built not from confession, but implication. It's strange, isn't it? How passion, denied its voice, found one in small talk. The Victorians spoke in layers. Every sentence was a house of mirrors, What was said reflected something else entirely. It was not deceit, exactly, but survival. To speak plainly was to risk everything, and so lovers learned to speak beautifully instead. You can almost hear them in your imagination, two people who could never say, "I want you," and so they said, "I admire your moral fortitude." It was safer, and somehow more thrilling, because within the tight boundaries of propriety, every gesture became charged with meaning. A hand lingering a second too long on a teacup handle, a shared laugh that dared to rise above the approved volume, a strand of hair rebelliously escaping its pins. In that world, romance was not loud, but electric, its energy hidden beneath silence, like fire under frost. The closer the rules pressed in, the more daring it became simply to look. To make love was, in essence, to build a castle of words where touch could not trespass. Letters, too, were part of this architecture. They were long, ornate, and almost comically indirect paragraphs about roses, church bells, or the moral decay of modern youth, all serving as coded messages of devotion. Ink became the pulse of the forbidden. And yet, every letter was also a risk. Once sent, it could be intercepted, misread, or weaponized by gossip. A lost envelope could end a reputation. So people wrote cautiously, balancing sincerity against survival, their emotions distilled into syntax and sealing wax. You might laugh now, thinking how absurdly repressed it all sounds. But there's something haunting about that restraint, something strangely romantic about a time when love had to earn its language, when words were the only safe skin two people could touch. The Victorians, for all their prudishness, were masters of emotional economy. They could compress entire novels into a sentence, entire lives into a glance. "You look well this evening, Miss Hartwell," said with just the right pause could mean, "You are the axis around which my thoughts now revolve." And she, folding her fan with studied indifference, might whisper, "The feeling is not unwelcome." To witness it was to watch two actors improvising in a play whose ending was already written. Society was the playwright, and propriety the stage manager. Yet the performers still found moments of truth between their lines. Beneath the lace, the fans, and the phrases, there was an unmistakable humanity. They were people longing to be seen, heard, and felt, just as we are only their vocabulary, for love was borrowed from etiquette manuals instead of hearts. And when conversation failed, silence became its own language. A shared pause could say more than a sonnet. A single heartbeat of eye contact across a crowded ballroom could unravel months of politeness. The Victorians knew this, they had to. Their entire world depended on subtext. And in a curious way, it made them experts at paying attention. They listened not just to words, but to the spaces between them. They read meaning in every breath. In that sense, making love, in the Victorian way, was perhaps the purest form of romance. It demanded patience, imagination, and the courage to feel without touching. If you're still with me, imagine how that must have felt, the ache of wanting to say more, the sweetness of being forced to say less, how a compliment about a parlor's wallpaper could make the heart race faster than any modern confession. It was love stripped of immediacy, love stretched thin across the wires of propriety, humming softly but never breaking. Perhaps it was painful, perhaps it was beautiful. Most likely, it was both. And so they continued, night after night, teacup after teacup, practicing the peculiar alchemy of Victorian affection, transmuting repression into art. Theirs was a world where the truest intimacy existed not in bedrooms, but in conversations. A place where emotion was not spoken, but sculpted, not displayed, but disguised. Where lovers met in parlors that smelled of roses and coal smoke, and made love carefully, eloquently, and without ever touching at all. By the time the lamps were extinguished and the last carriage rolled away into the fog, their hearts had said everything their tongues could not. The mother in the next room believed all was proper. The servants whispered that the young man had fine manners, and the girl, alone in her chamber, pressed a folded note to her chest and smiled, for she had heard what no one else had, hidden perfectly within the polite absurdity of conversation. A declaration disguised as small talk, a love that dared not speak its name, but found a way to whisper it anyway. By the time a Victorian girl like Elenina Hartwell turned 17, her purpose had already been written for her, not in ink, but in expectation. Every lesson, every sermon, every stitch of embroidery had prepared her not for a career, or discovery, or freedom, but for marriage. That was the axis upon which her entire world spun. Marriage was not simply a milestone, it was a moral duty, a social necessity, and in many cases, the only exit from a household that had already begun to feel like a gilded cage. The morning after her 19th birthday, Elenina sat beside her mother at the breakfast table, watching steam curl from a silver teapot. Her father discussed the price of coal and the mayor's latest speech, while her mother, eyes bright but calculating, mentioned casually that Lord Weatherby's son has returned from Calcutta. There was no hint of excitement in her tone, only the subtle emphasis of opportunity. Elenina lowered her gaze to her plate. She knew that tone well. It meant that the time had come not for adventure, but for arrangement. For respectable women of her class, employment was unthinkable. Work belonged to the poor. Independence was dangerous. Ambition, unbecoming. A lady could paint, sing, or play the piano, but never for money. Her education was ornamental. Her intelligence, something to be admired in conversation, but never displayed in argument. The greatest compliment one could pay a young woman was to call her accomplished, which meant she could dance gracefully, speak a little French, and stay silent when it mattered most. And so, marriage became not a choice, but a career, the only one available. The entire machinery of Victorian society revolved around ensuring that women fulfilled this singular destiny. Every season in London, every ball, every afternoon tea was a marketplace disguised as civility. The dance floor was the trading floor. The men held fortunes, the women futures. Behind every polite introduction was a negotiation, dowries, connections, lineage, and land. Love, if it appeared at all, was an accidental luxury, like sunlight slipping through a cracked shutter. You might imagine this world shimmering with elegant silk gowns, candlelit banquets, violins sighing in the distance, but beneath the lace there was calculation. A smile had value, a laugh, currency, a glance, a gamble. Elenina understood this even before her mother explained it outright. "A woman's reputation is her dowry," she said one evening while brushing her daughter's hair. "Guard it as you would your life. Without it, no man will have you. And without a man—" She paused, the brush hovering midair. She didn't need to finish. The silence said enough. In those days, to remain unmarried was to vanish from relevance. The term spinster hung over every unwed woman like a ghostly condemnation, a reminder that virtue without marriage was as useless as a candle without flame. Widows at least had stories. Spinsters had none. They became governesses, companions, quiet shadows in other people's homes. The world pitied them publicly and mocked them privately, as though solitude itself were a sin. Marriage, therefore, was salvation and sentence. It offered financial stability, social approval, and the illusion of purpose. But it also demanded surrender, of property, of autonomy, of name. The moment a woman said, "I do," the law erased her individuality. She became one with her husband, and by one, the Victorians meant his. Her inheritance, if she had any, passed into his hands. Her body, by law and by scripture, was no longer hers. Even her children, should she have them, legally belonged to him. To be a wife was to vanish politely into another person's life, like ink dissolving in water. Elenina knew all of this, of course. Every girl did. They learned it the way they learned to sew through repetition, through observation, through the soft indoctrination of daily life. It was whispered into bedtime stories and embroidered into samplers. To love, honor, and obey. She had seen the pattern unfold countless times. Her mother, her aunts, the ladies at church. Each had begun radiant and young, corseted in promise, only to dim slowly into respectability. And yet, for all its cruelty, marriage still glittered like a prize. Because what was the alternative? Dependence on aging parents, a life of quiet invisibility, the slow erosion of worth in a society that measured women by their usefulness to men. Even rebellion in this context required privilege, and Elenina, like most, could not afford it. So she learned the game. She mastered the art of conversation, the subtlety of restraint. She practiced the faint, graceful laugh that said, "I am amused but not overwhelmed." She learned to walk as if carried by invisible strings, elegant, deliberate, untouchable. The church sermons told her that patience was a virtue, modesty a virtue, obedience a virtue. No one ever called freedom one. If you're still with me, imagine how narrow the world must have felt from her perspective. Corridors filled with ticking clocks and whispered expectations. Even her diary, the only place where her true thoughts might breathe, had to be written in code, lest it be discovered and read. Her words became as veiled as her expressions. "The weather remains gray today," might mean despair. "I practice piano for 2 hours," might mean loneliness. "I am to dine with guests," might mean dread. Every emotion hid behind civility, like a candle behind frosted glass. Her social debut, the so-called coming out, was not freedom, but evaluation. She stood in a crowded ballroom beneath chandeliers that glowed like captured stars, her body wrapped in white silk, her heart pounding beneath whalebone and lace. Around her, men assessed her with polite indifference, as though examining merchandise. Each bow, each curtsy, each step of the waltz was an audition. Somewhere in the room, her mother smiled tightly, whispering to an acquaintance, "She dances beautifully, doesn't she?" What she really meant was, "Please, let someone choose her." And someone did eventually. Not for love at first, but for lineage, compatibility, and convenience. The conversation about courtship began not between Elenina and her suitor, but between their parents over tea. A good match, her father declared. And that was that. Love, if it was to come, would have to fit itself around duty. To our modern ears, this may sound cruel, almost transactional, and yet, within that cold arrangement, there was a quiet dignity. These women, bound by custom and law, still found ways to shape meaning from their narrow circumstances. They created intimacy out of ritual, affection out of obligation. They made homes not just of bricks and gardens, but of endurance. Their strength was invisible because it had to be. By candlelight, late at night, Elenina would sometimes imagine another kind of world, one where women could work, speak, or even walk unaccompanied without shame. She had read of such things in novels, women who painted, traveled, even wrote their own names on books. But those were fictions, as distant to her as the moon outside her window. The real world did not allow such luxuries. The real world allowed only one form of recognition: a ring, a title, a husband's name written neatly beside her own in the parish register. And so, like countless others, she prepared herself to step into that life with the same calm resignation she wore each morning with her corset. The ceremony would come, the vows would be spoken, and she would smile as though she believed them all. For in Victorian England, happiness was not expected, only propriety. To want more was ungrateful. To speak it aloud was dangerous. Still, deep beneath the layers of lace and discipline, something faint and fierce survived. A quiet awareness that she was more than her dowry, more than her posture, more than the name she would someday take. That awareness was her rebellion, invisible, unspoken, but alive. The world would never hear her shout, But sometimes, when the house slept and the fire had burned low, she would whisper to the dark, "I am still here." And the darkness, kind as it sometimes could be, would whisper back, "Yes, my dear, for now." By the time a Victorian girl like Elenina Hartwell turned 17, her purpose had already been written for her, not in ink, but in expectation. Every lesson, every sermon, every stitch of embroidery had prepared her not for a career, or discovery, or freedom, but for marriage. That was the axis upon which her entire world spun. Marriage was not simply a milestone. It was a moral duty, a social necessity, and in many cases, the only exit from a household that had already begun to feel like a gilded cage. The morning after her 19th birthday, Elenina sat beside her mother at the breakfast table, watching steam curl from a silver teapot. Her father discussed the price of coal and the mayor's latest speech, while her mother, eyes bright but calculating, mentioned casually that Lord Weatherby's son has returned from Calcutta. There was no hint of excitement in her tone, only the subtle emphasis of opportunity. Elenina lowered her gaze to her plate. She knew that tone well. It meant that the time had come not for adventure, but for arrangement. For respectable women of her class, employment was unthinkable. Work belonged to the poor. Independence was dangerous. Ambition, unbecoming. A lady could paint, sing, or play the piano, but never for money. Her education was ornamental. Her intelligence, something to be admired in conversation but never displayed in argument. The greatest compliment one could pay a young woman was to call her accomplished, which meant she could dance gracefully, speak a little French, and stay silent when it mattered most. And so, marriage became not a choice, but a career, the only one available. The entire machinery of Victorian society revolved around ensuring that women fulfilled this singular destiny. Every season in London, every ball, every afternoon tea was a marketplace disguised as civility. The dance floor was the trading floor. The men held fortunes. The women, futures. Behind every polite introduction was a negotiation: dowries, connections, lineage, and land. Love, if it appeared at all, was an accidental luxury, like sunlight slipping through a cracked shutter. You might imagine this world shimmering with elegant silk gowns, candlelit banquets, violins sighing in the distance, but beneath the lace there was calculation. A smile had value, a laugh, currency, a glance, a gamble. Elenina understood this even before her mother explained it outright. "A woman's reputation is her dowry," she said one evening, while brushing her daughter's hair. "Guard it as you would your life. Without it, no man will have you. And without a man—" She paused, the brush hovering midair. She didn't need to finish. The silence said enough. In those days, to remain unmarried was to vanish from relevance. The term spinster hung over every unwed woman like a ghostly condemnation, a reminder that virtue without marriage was as useless as a candle without flame. Widows at least had stories. Spinsters had none. They became governesses, companions, quiet shadows in other people's homes. The world pitied them publicly and mocked them privately, as though solitude itself were a sin. Marriage, therefore, was salvation and sentence. It offered financial stability, social approval, and the illusion of purpose. But it also demanded surrender of property, of autonomy, of name. The moment a woman said, "I do," the law erased her individuality. She became one with her husband, and by one, the Victorians meant his. Her inheritance, if she had any, passed into his hands. Her body, by law and by scripture, was no longer hers. Even her children, should she have them, legally belonged to him. To be a wife was to vanish politely into another person's life, like ink dissolving in water. Elenina knew all of this, of course. Every girl did. They learned it the way they learned to sew, through repetition, through observation, through the soft indoctrination of daily life. It was whispered into bedtime stories and embroidered into samplers. To love, honor, and obey. She had seen the pattern unfold countless times. Her mother, her aunts, the ladies at church. Each had begun radiant and young, corseted in promise, only to dim slowly into respectability. And yet, for all its cruelty, marriage still glittered like a prize. Because what was the alternative? Dependence on aging parents, a life of quiet invisibility, the slow erosion of worth in a society that measured women by their usefulness to men. Even rebellion, in this context, required privilege, and Elenina, like most, could not afford it. So she learned the game. She mastered the art of conversation, the subtlety of restraint. She practiced the faint, graceful laugh that said, "I am amused, but not overwhelmed." She learned to walk as if carried by invisible strings, elegant, deliberate, untouchable. The church sermons told her that patience was a virtue, modesty a virtue, obedience a virtue. No one ever called freedom one. If you're still with me, imagine how narrow the world must have felt from her perspective. Corridors filled with ticking clocks and whispered expectations. Even her diary, the only place where her true thoughts might breathe, had to be written in code, lest it be discovered and read. Her words became as veiled as her expressions. "The weather remains gray today" might mean despair. "I practiced piano for 2 hours" might mean loneliness. "I am to dine with guests" might mean dread. Every emotion hid behind civility, like a candle behind frosted glass. Her social debut, the so-called coming out, was not freedom, but evaluation. She stood in a crowded ballroom beneath chandeliers that glowed like captured stars, her body wrapped in white silk, her heart pounding beneath whalebone and lace. Around her, men assessed her with polite indifference, as though examining merchandise. Each bow, each curtsy, each step of the waltz was an audition. Somewhere in the room, her mother smiled tightly, whispering to an acquaintance, "She dances beautifully, doesn't she?" What she really meant was, "Please, let someone choose her." And someone did eventually. Not for love, at first, but for lineage, compatibility, and convenience. The conversation about courtship began not between Elenina and her suitor, but between their parents over tea. A good match, her father declared, and that was that. Love, if it was to come, would have to fit itself around duty. To our modern ears, this may sound cruel, almost transactional. And yet, within that cold arrangement, there was a quiet dignity. These women, bound by custom and law, still found ways to shape meaning from their narrow circumstances. They created intimacy out of ritual, affection out of obligation. They made homes not just of bricks and gardens, but of endurance. Their strength was invisible because it had to be. By candlelight, late at night, Elenina would sometimes imagine another kind of world, one where women could work, speak, or even walk, unaccompanied without shame. She had read of such things in novels, women who painted, traveled, even wrote their own names on books. But those were fictions, as distant to her as the moon outside her window. The real world did not allow such luxuries. The real world allowed only one form of recognition: a ring, a title, a husband's name written neatly beside her own in the parish register. And so, like countless others, she prepared herself to step into that life with the same calm resignation she wore each morning with her corset. The ceremony would come, the vows would be spoken, and she would smile as though she believed them all. For in Victorian England, happiness was not expected, only propriety. To want more was ungrateful. To speak it aloud was dangerous. Still, deep beneath the layers of lace and discipline, something faint and fierce survived. A quiet awareness that she was more than her dowry, more than her posture, more than the name she would someday take. That awareness was her rebellion, invisible, unspoken, but alive. The world would never hear her shout, but sometimes, when the house slept and the fire had burned low, she would whisper to the dark, "I am still here." And the darkness, kind as it sometimes could be, would whisper back, "Yes, my dear, for now." By the time a young Victorian lady was formally introduced to society, Her life became an open performance. Every movement, every glance, every syllable she uttered was scrutinized by eyes that saw not her heart but her prospects. Courtship in the 19th century was not a romance. It was a ritual, one wrapped in lace, silence, and the rustling of judgmental skirts. Love, if it happened, had to tiptoe through parlors full of witnesses. For Elenina Hartwell, that ritual began one gray Sunday afternoon in her family's drawing room. The curtains were drawn against the drizzle, the fire carefully stoked, the furniture arranged to create the illusion of spontaneity. Tea steamed on the table, not too hot, not too cold. A plate of seed cake sat untouched, waiting for the right conversational cue. Her mother had spent the entire morning rehearsing the choreography. How Elenina would sit, how she would smile, how long her eyes might linger on the guest before looking demurely away. The guest, of course, was the reason for the day's tension. Thomas Weatherby, recently returned from India, with a reputation for politeness, a fortune built on trade, and a spine straight enough to suggest good breeding. The moment arrived with the sound of carriage wheels in the gravel. The doorbell rang. The maid entered first, announcing his name as if summoning destiny. And then, in he came tall, dark coat damp with rain, a trace of foreign air about him, the faint scent of spice and sea. He bowed, she curtsied. No one spoke for 3 full seconds, as if the atmosphere itself were waiting for permission to breathe. Mr. Weatherby, Mrs. Hartwell began with a smile that concealed a lifetime of calculation. We are most pleased to receive you. Elenina has just been practicing her pianoforte. Perhaps, if you're lucky, she'll favor us with a song later. Elenina blushed on cue, lowering her eyes. I'm afraid I play poorly, sir. A modest woman is always a better musician, he replied, and the room laughed politely. The game had begun. Courtship in the Victorian age was a kind of theater, but one where improvisation was forbidden. Every visit, every cup of tea, every carefully measured pause was part of a larger choreography dictated by social manuals and parental expectation. No one was free in these encounters, not even the furniture. Sofas were arranged at proper conversational distances. Windows were cracked just enough for air, but not enough to blur sound. A chaperone in this case, Mrs. Hartwell, occupied the corner like a sentinel of propriety, her embroidery needle flicking in rhythm to every word. A meeting like this one could last an hour or less, but its consequences might span lifetimes. A misplaced comment could destroy a reputation. A too familiar tone might brand a woman forward. And yet, within those suffocating rules, emotion still found ways to breathe. Thomas spoke of India, of monsoons and tigers and the unbearable heat. Elenina listened, pretending interest in geography, while secretly studying the shape of his hands, the quiet confidence of his voice. Every word was polite, every silence electric. The conversation drifted to books, as it often did when the real subject desire was forbidden. Do you read much, Miss Hartwell? He asked, eyes glinting. I do, though nothing improper, she replied, and the corner of his mouth lifted the Victorian equivalent of a laugh. Improper could mean almost anything in that world. Novels about love, or poetry that rhymed too well. When Mrs. Hartwell rose to adjust the curtains, Thomas allowed himself one brief, unchaperoned moment. I find, he said softly, that people who read nothing improper are often the most interesting. She didn't answer, but the faintest smile appeared, the kind that could only be seen, not heard. You see, in this era, silence was often the loudest language. Courtship resembled diplomacy more than affection. Both sides negotiated carefully, cloaked in politeness. What could not be said outright was expressed through gesture, the angle of a bow, the speed of a glance, the trembling of a gloved hand over a teacup. A young woman's entire emotional vocabulary existed in her fingertips. As the rain intensified against the windows, conversation turned to safer ground: the Queen's charity events, the state of London roads, a recent sermon on humility. Mrs. Hartwell nodded approvingly at every mention of virtue. When Thomas complimented the moral tone of the household, she smiled as though the match were already made. But Elenina, sitting quietly by the hearth, felt the walls closing in the faint awareness that she was both participant and prisoner in this elegant performance. Every breath she took was measured against expectation. Still, something in Thomas's manner was different. He didn't boast, as other suitors had. His voice held a steadiness that made her curious. When he looked at her, he did not seem to be evaluating, merely observing, as if he were trying to read a language no one else in the room could see. It unsettled her, this sense of being understood without words. Courtship under surveillance was a strange paradox. Intimacy enacted in public. Families gathered like witnesses at a trial, judging compatibility through manners and metaphors. Servants eavesdropped in doorways. Neighbors compared notes after church. Every courtship was, in essence, a community project. Privacy was the one luxury no woman could afford, because privacy bred suspicion. Even letters were not safe. If a gentleman wished to write, he sent his note first to the lady's mother, who read it before delivering it. Replies were dictated aloud to ensure propriety. To say, "I admire your kindness," was acceptable. To write, "I think of you often," was scandalous. Yet both meant the same thing, and both were understood perfectly. The Victorians did not lack passion. They simply disguised it beneath layers of ritual, like smuggling flame in a silk glove. Later that evening, after Thomas had left and the rain had softened into drizzle, Mrs. Hartwell closed the parlor door and turned to her daughter. "He is respectable," she said, "educated, well-mannered, and of means. I think you behaved admirably." Thank you, Mama," Elenina answered, though her heart was still somewhere in the pause between his last words and the door closing behind him. "You will see him again on Thursday. But do remember, a lady must never appear eager." "Of course. Never eager. Always poised, always careful. Even affection had to be disguised as indifference. Love itself was not forbidden, only its evidence. The art of courtship, therefore, was the art of almost speaking, almost touching, almost confessing. If you're still awake, try to imagine the exhaustion of it, the sheer concentration required to live an entire love story without ever being alone. To speak softly, yet never too softly. To smile, but never too broadly. A romance built on restraint, where the slightest misstep could undo everything. It sounds suffocating, and it was. But within that restraint, there was also a strange beauty, the way the forbidden makes even the smallest gestures shimmer with significance. In that drawing room, as the fire burned low and the scent of tea faded, something small but undeniable had shifted. The meeting was over, but the memory of it lingered like perfume, faint, deliberate, inescapable, somewhere in her chest, beneath the corset's pressure and the weight of propriety. Elenina felt the first quiet ache of something both terrifying and tender. And upstairs, in her journal written under candlelight, she dared to write a single sentence that would never be read aloud. He spoke as though the room were not watching. Thomas Weatherby entered Elenina's life, the way certain storms do quietly at first, all calm surface and distant thunder. There was nothing ostentatious in his manner, no dramatic entrance or eager charm. He simply arrived one misty afternoon, bringing with him the faint scent of sandalwood and foreign dust, the kind of air that clings to a man who has stood too long under other suns. The drawing room, already small and heavy with the perfume of lilies, seemed to shrink around him. England, to Thomas, must have felt impossibly fragile after India, a place of porcelain teacups, murmured propriety, and people who had never seen a monsoon. He had the look of someone accustomed to endurance, tall, broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man who had learned discipline as survival, not decorum. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but deliberate, shaped by the cadences of command. Yet behind that composure flickered something restless, a faint dissonance, as though his body had returned home but his mind had not followed. It was the mark of many men who came back from the colonies too old for their years, too quiet for the rooms that received them. They were ghosts dressed as gentlemen. The polite world, however, saw none of that. To the matrons of Kensington and the matchmakers of Bloomsbury, he was the perfect prize. Respectable lineage, sufficient fortune, and the exotic sheen of adventure. India has matured him, Mrs. Hartwell whispered approvingly after his first visit, as though colonization itself were a finishing school. Elena said nothing, but she remembered how his gaze had drifted toward the window when her mother mentioned Calcutta, how his fingers had tightened slightly around the teacup, as though holding onto something invisible. He had been a civil officer in Bengal for nearly 7 years, part of that grand imperial machinery that kept the British Empire polished and profitable. He never spoke of it in detail. Administrative work, he called it, though the faint tension in his jaw suggested otherwise. India, after all, was not a place one simply worked in. It was a crucible that tested what one believed about order, justice, and power. Those who returned seldom did so unchanged. When Thomas spoke of the East, his words were measured, almost reverent. He described the unbearable brightness of noon, when even the air seemed to shimmer with heat, and the strange stillness before a monsoon, when the world held its breath. "The rain there," he said once, almost to himself, "doesn't fall, it attacks." Then, realizing the odd silence his words had created, he smiled faintly and returned to safer topics: London weather, the railway expansion, Her Majesty's latest portrait. But Elena had noticed the slip, the brief fracture in his gentlemanly armor, and it stayed with her. In the months that followed, he became a frequent guest, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for tea, sometimes on the pretext of borrowing a book. The house began to anticipate his presence, the way one anticipates a storm, quietly, nervously, with a mixture of dread and excitement. Even the servants behaved differently when he arrived, more efficient, less talkative, as though sensing the gravity of something they could not name. He was never loud, never boastful. His politeness was almost unsettling in its precision, each gesture practiced but sincere. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions others would have overlooked. "Do you walk much, Miss Hartwell? Do you find the London air dreary?" Small things, perhaps, but delivered with a softness that made them linger. When he looked at her, it was not the way other men did, not as a judge assessing worth, but as an exile studying home. And yet, there was a strangeness about him that neither Elena nor her mother could quite place. A certain melancholy that didn't fit into the neat rhythms of London society. He would pause mid-sentence, as though remembering something that had no place in conversation, the way a soldier might recall the sound of distant drums. His hands, though refined, bore faint traces of old scars, and sometimes, when the fire popped too loudly, his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. He seemed to inhabit two worlds at once, the well-mannered England around him, and some unspoken wilderness within. If you're still awake, you can probably see the paradox forming, the allure of mystery wrapped in propriety, the way a woman might be drawn not to what a man says, but to what he withholds. In a world that prized predictability, Thomas was an enigma. He made silence feel alive. And for Elena, raised among rituals and repetition, that was dangerously magnetic. Society, of course, adored him. Invitations multiplied, gossip followed. "A man of the empire," they said admiringly, as though those words alone explained his worth. Few asked what the empire had demanded of him in return. It was easier to romanticize than to reckon. To London's polite world, Thomas Weatherby was a symbol of duty, of adventure, of Britain's unshakable reach. To Elena, he was something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more complicated. A man who had learned how to hide grief behind grace. Once, during a garden visit, she found him standing by the iron gate, staring out at the gray horizon. The conversation had dwindled. Her chaperone was busy discussing hymnals with a neighbor. It was the first time they had been almost alone. "Do you miss India?" she asked softly. He hesitated before answering. "No," he said at last. though sometimes I think it still misses me." It was a strange reply, poetic, almost mournful. She wanted to ask more, but he turned the question back toward her, as though to redirect attention away from himself. "And you, Miss Hartwell, do you ever wish to see the world?" She smiled faintly. "I've hardly seen London." He nodded, and the faintest shadow of a smile crossed his lips. "Then you are fortunate. The less one sees, the less one remembers." It was the kind of statement that could have meant anything: regret, wisdom, warning. But in the hush of that moment, it felt like a confession. There were other moments like this, fleeting and fragile. A glance shared across a crowded room, the brief brush of hands over a teacup, the silence that followed a question neither dared to ask. To the world around them, theirs was a perfectly proper acquaintance. To them, it was something else, a conversation unfolding beneath the surface of every polite exchange. He once brought her a book of poetry, Browning, bound in dark green leather, and said, "You might enjoy this. It reminds me of quiet courage." When she opened it later that night, she found a dried leaf pressed between the pages, brittle and yellowed by time. It looked nothing like the leaves outside her window. Perhaps it had once fallen from a tree in Bengal. Perhaps it was nothing at all. But to her, it felt like a secret, a token from a world she could never enter. Her mother, meanwhile, grew ever more approving. "He is serious-minded," she said one evening, "and he listens when you speak. That is rare in a man of standing." But what Mrs. Hartwell could not see, or perhaps chose not to, was the shadow behind his calm. Thomas spoke of the world as though it were something both beautiful and cruel, and in his presence, even Elenina's perfectly ordered life began to feel slightly fragile. He told her once, "The Empire teaches us to build walls, Miss Hartwell, but walls are poor company." She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Yet later, as she sat in her room writing in her diary, she found herself repeating those words, "Walls are poor company," and wondering if he spoke only of empires or of hearts as well. In time, Thomas became a fixture of their lives, always polite, always punctual, always slightly apart. He never overstayed, never presumed, but when he left, the air seemed to shift. The clock ticked louder, the fire burned duller, the rooms felt emptier. His absence had weight. Society would call him a gentleman. History might call him a servant of the empire. But Elenina, and perhaps only she, began to see him as something else entirely. A man standing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He carried the grandeur of the British Empire on his shoulders and the burden of its contradictions in his eyes. And though he would never say it aloud, she sensed that he envied her for the very smallness of her world, its safety, its simplicity, its ignorance of what lay beyond. In that understanding, unspoken but mutual, something fragile took root. Love, perhaps, though not the kind one finds in novels. It was quieter, sadder, like two people standing at opposite ends of a long corridor, each afraid to move forward in case the illusion broke. Thomas Weatherby, the gentleman from India, was, in the end, a man both haunted and human. To everyone else, he was proof of England's reach. To Elenina, he was proof of its loneliness. And though she could never have known it then, their meeting would become the first step in her education, not in etiquette, but in empathy. Because to love someone like him was to understand that even the most polished souls carry ashes beneath their shoes. And somewhere in that polished drawing room, amid the ticking clock and the scent of tea, the distance between them began very quietly to close. Their courtship did not begin with fireworks, nor even with words, but with teacups porcelain thin as secrets, rattling softly on saucers as though aware of their own fragility. Every Thursday afternoon, at precisely 4, Thomas Weatherby returned to the Hartwell residence. The ritual had settled into the rhythm of the house itself, as dependable as the chiming clock on the mantelpiece. The maid would prepare the drawing room, the fire would be coaxed into a respectful glow, and Elenina, now accustomed to the quiet choreography of expectation, would take her place near the window, hands folded, expression serene. Outside, London existed in perpetual drizzle. Inside, time slowed to the pace of a teaspoon stirring sugar. It is strange, isn't it? How affection can grow not in grand gestures, but in repetition. The same chair, the same teapot, the same careful greetings, spoken as though nothing had changed when in truth, everything had. Each week, their conversation traced familiar paths: books, weather, travel, and poetry. But beneath those practiced exchanges ran something else, a hum just below the surface, like the resonance of a string plucked but never allowed to sound. "Do you ever tire of the rain, Miss Hartwell?" Thomas asked once, after a particularly gray afternoon had blurred the world into watercolor. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the handle of her cup. "One mustn't tire of what cannot be escaped, Mr. Weatherby. The rain has excellent manners. It always calls when least convenient." He laughed quietly, and for a moment the air shifted. That sound, low, genuine, unguarded, startled her more than any declaration could have. In that laugh was the suggestion of warmth long denied, the kind of humanity London society tried so desperately to disguise. Each Thursday followed a similar rhythm. He arrived precisely on time. Her mother joined for the first half hour, discussing charitable events, mutual acquaintances, and matters safe enough to make God yawn. Then, as propriety demanded, Mrs. Hartwell would excuse herself, claiming letters to write or servants to scold, and the room would exhale. Silence would bloom in her absence, not awkward but alive, the kind that filled the space between two people who knew they were being careful with something precious. They spoke of poetry often: Tennyson, Wordsworth, occasionally Elizabeth Barrett Browning, though Thomas hesitated when Elenina mentioned her name. "Too earnest," he said once, though the softness in his tone betrayed admiration. She teased him gently for it, asking whether India had burned the romantic out of him. He smiled at that, but his eyes, always distant, always thoughtful, seemed to answer yes. And yet, in those afternoons, she saw pieces of that lost romantic return. The way he leaned forward slightly when she spoke, the way he turned his cup just so before answering, as if buying time to soften whatever truth sat on his tongue. Once, as she poured his tea, her hand brushed his. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but both felt it, that small, seismic jolt that transforms air into electricity. Neither spoke for several seconds afterward. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock, a reminder that even forbidden moments were still subject to time. You might imagine that such restraint would make affection brittle, but in truth, it made it exquisite. Deprivation sharpened every detail. A look became an event, a phrase, a confession. They learned to communicate in the margins of civility through glances, through pauses, through the subtle choreography of politeness stretched thin. When she asked if he preferred sugar or honey, and he replied, "Neither, I prefer the tea as it is," something in her chest tightened, though she could not have explained why. Sometimes, when conversation drifted to poetry, they would read aloud. She, with the bright clarity of someone raised in drawing rooms. He, with the slow gravity of one accustomed to silence. On one occasion, she read from Shelley, "We look before and after, and pine for what is not." Her voice faltered slightly on the final line. When she looked up, he was already watching her, expression unreadable. "A cruel line," he murmured, "because it's true." What could she say to that? Words, in those moments, felt both inadequate and dangerous. So she did what Victorian women did best. She smiled, lowered her gaze, and let the silence do the talking. Outside, the rain persisted, tapping gently at the glass, like the polite ghost of everything they couldn't say aloud. Inside, the fire burned low, and the edges of the world seemed to soften. Mrs. Hartwell's footsteps echoed occasionally in the corridor, a reminder that supervision was never far away. And yet, even under watchful eyes, something continued to unfold. Each meeting grew infinitesimally less formal. The pauses between questions lengthened. The smiles grew warmer. less defensive. There was, at last, the ease of shared ritual, though neither mistook it for safety. The danger of affection under supervision was that it never remained innocent for long. Every teacup was a mask, every glance a rebellion. Once, when the conversation had strayed to music, Thomas mentioned that he could play the violin, though not well enough for polite company. Elenina, in a rare moment of boldness, replied, "Then perhaps you should play for impolite company." He looked at her, surprised by the tease, and for a moment the practiced veneer cracked not in scandal, but in recognition. It was the first time she had seen him look younger. Their ritual began to extend beyond tea. Occasionally he sent a note, always proper, always brief, requesting permission for a visit. The letters were read first by her mother, of course, but even within those boundaries, he found ways to slip meaning through. "I hope the rain has not been too unkind," one letter read, which meant, perhaps, "I am thinking of you." She answered through her replies, careful phrasing about the garden, the weather, the health of her father, each sentence balanced delicately between duty and desire. If you pause and think about it, it's almost tragic how little they had, and how much they made of it. No touch, no privacy, no freedom. Just words wrapped in decorum and eyes that spoke rebellion in the language of restraint. Yet, for them, it was enough, or at least enough to sustain the illusion that affection might grow within a cage. One Thursday, late in February, he brought her a small book bound in navy leather, Keats's poems. "I thought," he said almost shyly, "you might appreciate his sense of melancholy." She smiled, tracing the edge of the cover. "And you thought I lacked it?" she asked. "On the contrary," he said. "I think you understand it too well." The fire popped softly between them. Neither spoke again for several minutes. In the weeks that followed, their small ritual became the axis around which her days revolved. She woke thinking of it, dressed for it, dreamed of it. Her mother began to comment on her improved complexion. Her father, more absorbed in politics than people, nodded his approval of Thomas's steady courtship. Everything appeared proper, unremarkable, and yet, beneath that veneer of domestic harmony, Elenina's world was quietly catching fire. There is a certain cruelty to Victorian romance, the way it forces passion into such narrow spaces that it either dies or becomes distilled into something potent, almost spiritual. Their affection was not expressed through embraces or declarations, but through the unbearable tenderness of almost touching, almost confessing, almost aloud. The distance between them became the very substance of their desire. One late afternoon, as the light turned amber through the lace curtains, she found herself watching him more openly than usual. He was reading, or pretending to, and the shadow of his profile danced against the window pane. When he looked up, their eyes met, and for the first time neither of them looked away. The moment stretched, silent, fragile, infinite. Then, deliberately, she reached for the teapot, breaking the spell. "More tea, Mr. Weatherby?" His smile was soft and just a touch sad. "Always, Miss Hartwell." And that was it. No confession, no kiss, no scandal. Just the quiet, steady surrender to a feeling that neither dared name. The world around them remained unchanged. The same ticking clock, the same scent of bergamot and coal smoke. But for those brief afternoons, within the boundaries of tea and civility, two souls managed to meet not in defiance of their age, but within its very rules. By the time Thomas left each evening, the air in the drawing room was always a few degrees warmer than when he arrived. Perhaps it was the fire, or perhaps something subtler, the heat that lingers in a room when two people have spoken too softly for too long. The teacups cooled, the door closed, the ritual ended. But upstairs, in her diary, Elenina would write the same line each week. "He looked at me again today, and I did not look away." And though she would never admit it aloud, that small act, that single, silent defiance, was the closest thing to freedom she had ever known. It happened on an ordinary morning, or at least, that was how it appeared. A gray mist had settled over London, draping itself over rooftops and railings like a shawl worn too often. Inside the Hartwell home, breakfast was a quiet ceremony of toast, marmalade, and conversation clipped to the length of a teaspoon. Elena sat where she always did, her eyes half lowered, her thoughts half elsewhere. When the knock came, 3 soft raps on the door, followed by the faint murmur of the butler's voice in the hallway. Her mother, Mrs. Hartwell, raised an eyebrow but did not pause in buttering her toast. Deliveries were common in their part of Kensington invitations, invoices, a cousin's thank you note. But when the maid entered carrying a small, ribboned parcel wrapped in brown paper, the rhythm of the room shifted, almost imperceptibly. For Miss Hartwell, the maid said, the package was unremarkable at first glance, modest, properly sized, and sealed with simple string. But even before Elenina touched it, she knew. There are moments when recognition doesn't come from logic, but from the quiet tremor beneath the skin, the body understanding before the mind does. She untied the string with careful fingers. Beneath the wrapping lay a bouquet small enough to be modest, yet deliberate enough to feel personal. Sweet peas, purple and white, their petals fragile as whispers. Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward slightly. From whom? There's no card, the maid answered, though both women already knew whose name lingered, unsent between those petals. Sweet peas. In the language of flowers, the only language a Victorian heart was allowed to speak without scandal, they meant thank you for a lovely time. Or sometimes, I think of you fondly. They were the floral equivalent of a sigh, gentle, polite, but alive with intention. Elenina stared at them for a long moment, her breath caught between amusement and something that felt dangerously like hope. Purple and white, she murmured. How precise. Her mother's tone was brisk. At least he has taste. Roses would have been too forward. She said it approvingly, but there was steel beneath the remark. The reminder that even beauty must obey the rules. You'll send a note of acknowledgement, of course. Nothing sentimental. Of course, Elenina replied. But her voice came out softer than intended. She couldn't look away from the bouquet. When Mrs. Hartwell left the table a few minutes later, Elenina stayed behind, pretending to sip her tea while her eyes kept drifting toward the flowers. The air around them seemed to shift, faintly perfumed, faintly electric. They were still wet from the morning dew, a drop of water clinging to one pale petal like a secret refusing to fall. Sweet peas were not extravagant. They were not the sort of flowers one sent to impress. They were chosen by someone who understood restraint, who knew that affection in their world could not shout it, had to whisper. Thomas Weatherby, she thought, was a man who whispered very carefully. You might think it foolish to feel so much over something so small, but in an age when every emotion had to pass through filters of propriety, a single bouquet could be as daring as a confession. Words were dangerous. Flowers were safe, but only just. They were loopholes for the heart. Later that morning, when she was alone, Elenina carried the bouquet upstairs to her room. She placed it in a narrow glass vase on the writing desk, where the light from the window touched it gently. Against the muted wallpaper and pale curtains, the purple blooms glowed faintly, a secret set to music only she could hear. She sat there for a while, doing nothing, saying nothing, simply feeling a forbidden act in itself. It was then that something curious happened. The house, usually full of ordinary noise, footsteps, chatter, the distant clang of the servant's bell, seemed to fade into stillness. Time slowed, as though even the air had agreed to pause for her. And in that quiet, Elenina realized she was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile of drawing rooms, but the kind that rose uninvited, born from within. Sweet peas, she whispered again, tracing one of the petals with her fingertip. The texture was softer than silk, but there was strength in its stem, a tiny contradiction, fragile yet stubborn. Perhaps that was what she felt for Thomas too. Something fragile, yet stubborn enough to persist against the rules. Downstairs, Mrs. Hartwell was already composing letters in her head, plans, inquiries, the invisible machinery of propriety turning. She would speak to Mr. Place of Tom, Weatherby's aunt, perhaps, or mention him casually at the next church luncheon. These things had to be handled delicately. Appearances were currency, feelings, liabilities. But Elena wasn't thinking of any of that. She was remembering the way he had once spoken of India, the quiet reverence in his voice, the loneliness hidden beneath. She wondered if he missed that world now, or if sending this bouquet had been his way of staying tethered to something warmer than the English rain. If you're still awake, picture her there, the pale morning light against her hair, the faint blush of color against her cheeks. Picture the vase beside the ink pot, the flowers reflected in the mirror behind her, doubling the illusion of abundance. She doesn't move for a long time. She just sits, looking at them, as if by doing so she might decode the language they were written in. Later that afternoon, she does what any respectable woman of her station must. She writes a thank you note. The words are carefully chosen, scrubbed clean of implication. Mr. Weatherby, I am deeply obliged for your thoughtfulness. The flowers brought much-needed brightness to this dreary morning. Yours sincerely, E. Hartwell. She reads it twice before sealing it with wax, her hand trembling only slightly. She knows her mother will read it before it is sent. She knows it must sound bland, but she also knows that Thomas, of all people, will read the unsaid. The bouquet lasts nearly a week. Each day, she changes the water, trims the stems, and watches as the blooms begin to wilt a slow, elegant fading. By the seventh morning, only the white petals remain bright, the purple ones curling inward, as though trying to keep their secret a little longer. When at last she removes them from the vase, she doesn't throw them away. Instead, she wraps the best of them in a page torn from her old poetry notebook and hides it in the drawer beneath her gloves. A foolish gesture, perhaps, but one that made the distance between them feel smaller. Meanwhile, London continued to move, indifferent as ever. Carriages clattered past. Fog rolled in. Society whispered its endless gossip. No one noticed that a quiet act of rebellion had occurred in one small house, that a man had sent flowers, and a woman had received them not as decoration, but as declaration. It is a peculiar truth of the Victorian world. The more rules there were, the more meaning slipped between them. A bouquet could say what a poem could not. And so, week by week, visit by visit, glance by glance, Elenina and Thomas built a language entirely their own, one of gestures, symbols, and silences. When they next met, the subject of flowers hovered unspoken in the air. Mrs. Hartwell praised the arrangement in passing. Thomas inclined his head modestly. Elenina said nothing. But when their eyes met across the tea table, something passed between them, faint but unmistakable, like a current beneath still water. It wasn't gratitude, nor mere politeness. It was recognition. And that is how it began, not with confession, not with a letter, not with some grand dramatic gesture, but with a handful of sweet peas on a rain-dimmed morning. Love, in the Victorian sense, did not bloom all at once. It unfolded in increments, like petals under cautious light. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the soft rustle of paper as the bouquet is unwrapped, the faint sigh of breath as her hand hovers above it, the quiet defiance of two hearts daring to exist in a world designed to keep them still. In another century, a message might arrive instantly, flashing across screens and distances. But in this one, it came in the shape of flowers, delicate, deliberate, and doomed to fade. And perhaps that was its beauty, that love, like the bouquet itself, could exist for a moment so brief yet feel, in that moment, eternal. When the last petal finally fell, Elenina didn't weep. She simply placed it inside her journal, between two blank pages, pressing it flat beneath the weight of history. Later generations might find it there dry, pale, silent, and never know that once it had been the color of longing. For her, though, it would always be alive. The first bouquet, the first tremor, the first sign that in a world ruled by rules, something as small as a flower could still bloom uninvited and make everything else for one quiet heartbeat. Feel real. The day they met at the Crystal Palace was unlike any other a day when the entire empire seemed to gleam. Even the air shimmered with novelty, carrying the scent of machinery, oil, and damp spring grass, as if London itself had decided to show off. The great glass and iron structure loomed like a miracle of geometry, sunlight spilling through its panes until everything beneath it glowed. Trees in cages of glass, fountains that sang, and engines that pulsed like metallic hearts. For Elenina, stepping through its arched entrance felt like walking into the future, a world too clean, too bright, too loud for her quiet upbringing. And waiting within it, as though he had been sculpted to match its newness, was Thomas Weatherby. He stood near one of the great exhibits, a colossal steam press that hissed softly with restrained power, his dark coat sharp against the glinting machinery. When he saw her approach, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not a smile, not surprise, but the faint, reverent look of someone who has been waiting for something he wasn't sure would arrive. "Miss Hartwell," he said, bowing slightly. "You've come." "I have," she replied, her voice lower than she intended. "I hear it's quite the spectacle." "It is," he said, glancing up at the glass dome, "though I'm not sure the machines are the only marvel here today." And it was the kind of line that should have sounded rehearsed, but somehow didn't. The air between them wavered, warm despite the spring chill. Around them, the crowd moved in polite murmurs, ladies in pastel gowns, gentlemen comparing engines and telegraphs, all of them oblivious to the small, quiet rebellion taking place in the middle of London's proudest temple to progress. Mrs. Hartwell trailed a few paces behind, absorbed by the displays of porcelain and textile machinery. Her presence, as always, was both shield and surveillance. But even she, practical and proud, seemed softened by the wonder of the place. The Crystal Palace was vast enough to make secrets feel possible. As they walked, Thomas gestured toward the exhibits. "Do you see, Miss Hartwell? They've managed to make iron look graceful. I used to think strength and beauty could never coexist. But here we are, the Empire proving me wrong." Elenina smiled faintly. "Perhaps beauty only appears graceful when it's caged in glass." He looked at her, then truly looked, and she felt the weight of it. "You sound as though you're speaking of something other than architecture." "Perhaps I am," she said, her voice light, though her pulse betrayed her. They moved slowly through the great hall, past engines that breathed steam like dragons tamed into servitude, past the displays of exotic plants brought from the far corners of the colonies, ferns from India, orchids from Singapore, all trapped beneath the same English sunlight. Everywhere, the air hummed with invention, the chorus of an age convinced it had conquered nature itself. Yet, in the midst of all that triumph, two people walked side by side, still governed by rules older and crueler than any machine. At the far end of the hall, they paused before a mirror installation, one of those new optical marvels that multiplied reflections endlessly. Their images stretched into infinity, 1,000 Eleninas, 1,000 Thomases, all standing just close enough to almost touch. The sight made her breath catch. "Curious, isn't it?" Thomas murmured. "In every reflection, we appear closer than we dare to be." Her voice was barely a whisper, and yet, it's still an illusion. He turned toward her, his expression soft but unreadable. "All love begins as illusion, Miss Hartwell. The danger lies in when it refuses to stay that way." For a long moment, neither spoke. Around them, the noise of the exhibition seemed to fade, the chatter of visitors, the hiss of steam, until only the faint ticking of her heart remained. She could see her reflection beside his in the mirror. Two figures poised between decorum and desire. The distance between them measured not in inches, but in centuries of expectation. "Tell me something," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Do you ever wish things were different?" She hesitated. The question itself was improper, but propriety had begun to feel like an enemy lately, one that guarded her too well. "Different how?" "That you could say what you mean." he said, his gaze steady. That you could live without translation. Elenina lowered her eyes, pretending to study her gloves. In our world, Mr. Weatherby, everything worth feeling requires translation. He smiled, a little sadly. And yet, here we are, fluent in silence. The remark lingered between them. It was not quite a declaration, not quite a confession. But something shifted in her, then something small and irreversible, like the first crack in glass that still looks perfect to the untrained eye. They left the hall and stepped into one of the side galleries, where the noise softened into distant echoes. The air smelled faintly of wax and rain on iron. Sunlight filtered through the ceiling, fractured by the panes above, until it scattered like gold dust. For a moment, the world felt suspended, unreal. Thomas stopped beside a display of telescopes. "Look," he said, gesturing toward one. "You can see the world closer than it wants to be seen." Elenina leaned over the eyepiece, more to humor him than from curiosity. Through the glass, she saw the distant spire of the palace's roof refracted and distorted closer, yet somehow unreachable. She straightened and found him watching her again. "You're not looking at the exhibit," she said softly. "No," he replied. "I'm not." Her heart stuttered. She knew she should step back, say something polite, laugh perhaps. But instead, she stayed perfectly still. It was as if the entire structure, every beam, every pane of glass was holding its breath with her. At last, he spoke again, his voice low. "Do you know what I miss most about India?" "What?" she managed to ask. "The sky," he said. The stars were so close it felt dangerous to look at them too long. Here, they're hidden by fog and by rules." He paused, his eyes distant. "But I think I prefer the danger." It was the first time he had spoken of longing without disguise. And in that moment, surrounded by machines and marvels, Elenina realized that no invention in the world could rival the reckless simplicity of what she felt. The sound of her mother's voice calling from the next gallery broke the spell. The world came rushing back, footsteps, laughter, the hiss of steam. Thomas straightened, his composure returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, "thank you for indulging my curiosity." "And thank you," she replied, "for reminding me that glass can still let in light." When they rejoined Mrs. Hartwell, both looked exactly as they had before, proper, composed, untouched by anything so vulgar as feeling. But anyone who had watched them closely, the way his hand lingered near hers as they walked, the way her eyes flickered toward him at every pause, would have known better. That evening, back in her room, Elenina opened her diary. The bouquet of sweet peas still lay pressed between the pages. Beneath it, she wrote, "We met at the palace today. Everything was made of glass, except the things that mattered." She stopped, the pen trembling slightly in her hand. For the first time, she understood the danger of being seen too clearly. Yet she also understood that there are moments when clarity is worth the risk, when truth, once glimpsed, refuses to fade. The Crystal Palace had been built to celebrate progress, the triumph of man over matter. But for two people walking beneath its glittering arches, it became something else entirely, a cathedral of restraint, where love was not confessed, but quietly discovered. And if you were to walk there now, if you could step through time and stand beneath that same roof of glass and iron, perhaps you might still feel it. The echo of footsteps that never touched, the warmth of a look that never turned into touch, the faint hum of two hearts, perfectly synchronized and perfectly silent, beneath the grand machinery of a world that prized invention but feared intimacy. In that moment, the Crystal Palace became more than a monument to industry. It became a mirror not of progress, but of humanity itself. Two reflections meeting for a single heartbeat before the crowd swallowed them again. And as Elenina left that day, the sunlight catching her veil, she felt something quietly monumental shift within her. The world had been built to keep her still, but for the first time, She had seen what it looked like to move not through space, but through feeling. The palace of glass receded behind her, gleaming in the distance like memory itself, transparent, fragile, impossible to forget. It began, as these things so often do in England, with rain. Not the polite drizzle that Londoners endured with stoicism, but a true downpour, the kind that erased the edges of the world and turned the gas lamps outside into trembling halos. The street glistened like black glass, and from the sitting room window, Elena watched the storm rage, her breath fogging the glass in small, uneven clouds. Dinner had ended hours ago. Her father was reading in his armchair, spectacles balanced precariously on the edge of his nose. Her mother sat nearby, sewing with the quiet diligence of someone who believed silence itself could keep the household in order. The hour was past 8, too late for visitors, too wet for walking, too loud for sleep. Yet through the noise of the storm, another sound came, a firm, deliberate knock. Her mother looked up, startled. At this hour? Before anyone could answer, the maid appeared, dripping from the vestibule, her apron darkened by rain. "It's Mr. Weatherby, ma'am. He says the matter's important." There was a pause. In it lived 1,000 unspoken questions. Then her father closed his book and adjusted his spectacles. "Show him in." When Thomas entered, the lamplight caught him like a portrait in motion, his coat soaked through, hat in hand, hair damp against his forehead. Yet his composure was intact. There was a steadiness in his presence, a sense that he had crossed not merely a storm, but a threshold he had long prepared for. He bowed to Mrs. Hartwell, greeted Elena with a brief nod that betrayed nothing of what passed through his eyes, and turned to her father. "Mr. Hartwell," he began, his voice calm though his shoulders trembled faintly with the cold, "I must beg your pardon for calling unannounced. I would not intrude at such an hour unless the matter were of real importance." Mr. Hartwell, whose life revolved around propriety and predictable schedules, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Go on, Mr. Weatherby." Thomas took a breath, the kind that steadies not only the lungs but the soul. "Sir," he said, "I come to ask your permission to pay my addresses to your daughter." It was a phrase born from Victorian diplomacy, to pay one's addresses, the coded way of saying I wish to court her, with the intention of marriage. But even cloaked in courtesy, the words hit the room like a struck bell. Mrs. Hartwell's needle paused midair. Elena's hands, resting in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. Her father leaned back in his chair, regarding Thomas with that slow, weighing expression men of his generation reserved for business and destiny alike. "You understand," Mr. Hartwell said finally, "that such intentions require both sincerity and means. You've returned recently from India, I believe?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "I served with the East India Company. I have since resigned my commission. My circumstances are modest but stable. I hold investments through my late father's estate and a partnership offer in Liverpool." "And your health?" the older man asked, as though love could be negotiated like livestock. Thomas smiled faintly. "Survivable?" A small silence followed, not awkward, but heavy, like the pause before a verdict. The rain hammered harder against the windows, as though the world itself were listening. Mrs. Hartwell spoke next, her voice smooth but cautious. "You've been a welcome guest in our home, Mr. Weatherby. We've appreciated your manners, your conversation, and your restraint." Her eyes flickered toward Elena, who had not moved. "But our daughter's welfare is not something we entrust lightly." "I would expect nothing less," Thomas said quietly. "My intention is honorable, and my regard sincere. I would not have come otherwise." He said nothing more, yet somehow the silence afterward was eloquent, filled with all that could not be spoken in a room lit by propriety and gaslight. Mr. Hartwell studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, slowly. "You have my permission to call, sir. We shall see how things proceed." Thomas bowed again, gratitude flickering through his composure. "You have my deepest thanks." That was all. The formalities of Victorian life did not permit declarations or embraces, not even in such a moment. But as he turned to leave, his gaze met Elenina's, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them stronger than words. It was not triumph nor relief, but recognition, the silent acknowledgement that a door had opened, fragile, precarious, and real. Her father returned to his chair, pretending to read. Her mother resumed her sewing, though the needle trembled slightly in her hand. And Elenina, compelled by something beyond manners, rose and stepped toward the vestibule. Thomas was already donning his hat again when she appeared. The entryway smelled of wet wool and storm air. The candlelight quivered in the draught, throwing faint shadows across his face. "You shouldn't have come in this weather," she said softly. "Perhaps not," he admitted, "but I've waded through longer storms." She hesitated, her hand hovering near the doorframe. "And what will you do now?" He looked past her, to the rain streaming down the window panes. "Wait again," he said, but now with hope. It should have been a simple line, the kind exchanged in novels and forgotten by supper. But in that moment, it carried the weight of every glance, every silence, every unsent letter between them. For a moment, the world outside ceased to matter. The rain, the thunder, the ticking clock, all blurred into the background hum of inevitability. Then, with the slow gravity of someone memorizing the moment, Thomas reached for his gloves. Their eyes met once more, and she saw in his expression something she had never seen before. Not confidence, not passion, but peace. The calm of a man who had finally done what he came to do. "Good evening, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Weatherby." And with that, he stepped out into the storm. The door closed behind him, but the sound of the rain lingered like applause withheld. Elenina stood there long after he had gone, her hand resting on the banister. The candle beside her burned low, the flame bending toward the door as though reluctant to let him leave. She thought of the phrase he had used to pay his addresses. Such an elegant euphemism for something so terrifying. The idea that love, in her world, needed permission, signatures, witnesses, that it could not exist without first being written into the ledger of respectability. And yet, even within those rules, something wild had taken root. Upstairs, in her room, she could still hear the rain. It drummed against the roof like a heart too large for its cage. She sat by the window, watching the street shimmer in the lamplight, and wondered where he was now, whether he had found shelter, or whether he was still walking through the downpour, hat pulled low, face lifted to the storm. For the first time, she envied the rain. It could touch him freely, trace the contours of his cheek, cling to his coat, whisper along his hands. It had no need for permission. When she finally went to bed, she did not sleep. Instead, she replayed every word, every glance, every tremor in his voice. She realized then that love, at least in her world, was not an explosion but an endurance, a quiet defiance that moved beneath the surface of rules. And though no music played, and no one witnessed it, that evening had been her proposal too, an unspoken yes, carried in her silence. Outside, the rain continued until dawn. The cobblestones gleamed silver beneath the first light, and the city woke as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But somewhere, in a modest house in Kensington, a young woman rose from her restless sleep and felt, for the first time, the quiet certainty that her life had shifted course. In another part of the city, a man sat beside his hearth, drying his coat and thinking of her, of the pale glow of the hallway lamp, of her voice soft as the rain itself. His future was no longer an abstraction, nor merely ambition. It had acquired a name, a shape, a heartbeat. If you're listening to this now, imagine that sound, the rain against glass. Steady, relentless, eternal. It was the same song lovers have always heard, in every century. And for Thomas and Elenina, it was the sound of courage disguised as weather, of propriety bending quietly beneath the weight of something older, gentler, and true. By morning, the clouds had broken, leaving the world washed clean. But the memory of that night of the knock, the permission, the trembling candlelight, would linger long after the puddles dried. In a world obsessed with restraint, two hearts had spoken honestly, if only for 20 minutes and under cover of rain. And sometimes, that was all history allowed. Marriage, in Victorian England, was not a union of souls. It was a quiet surrender dressed in lace. The ceremony itself was tender enough, the language beautifully deceptive. Words like honor, cherish, and obey floated through the air like blessings, softening the sharp edges of what they truly meant. But behind the hymns and flowers and trembling vows, there waited the ink, the legal truth. And once the ink dried, the bride ceased to exist as she had been. When Elenina Hartwell became Mrs. Thomas Weatherby, she crossed an invisible line from person to property. The change was neither violent nor sudden. It was a vanishing, a soft erasure that the law called unity. Under the doctrine of coverture, her legal identity dissolved into her husband's. She could not sign a contract, own a house, or even hold her own wages, should she ever have earned them. The world believed this was protection, that a woman's dependence on her husband was a blessing, that submission was safety. In truth, it was an elegant kind of imprisonment, gilded with affection and good manners. On the morning after their wedding, Elenina awoke not to the romance of new beginnings, but to the stillness of realization. Their room, was spacious, well-appointed, and utterly foreign. Her belongings, once neatly arranged in her old home, had been absorbed into his, her hairbrush beside his razor, her letters tucked among his papers. Even her name, which she had written 1,000 times on school essays and private notes, now belonged to someone else. She was no longer Elenina Hartwell, but a derivative, an echo of her husband's existence. He, of course, treated her with gentleness. Thomas was not cruel nor careless. He held doors, listened to her opinions at breakfast, and asked after her sleep with the gravity of a man who had faced both war and silence. But even kindness could not disguise the imbalance written into the fabric of their life. When she signed her first letter as Mrs. Weatherby, she hesitated. The pen hovered above the page, trembling slightly. Her own name, Elenina, felt like a whisper lost between the lines. She had always been told marriage was a kind of freedom. Freedom from loneliness, from scandal, from dependence on her parents. Yet as she wrote that new name for the first time, she felt the opposite. She felt claimed. The irony of the age was cruelly precise. The Victorians adored love, wrote novels about it, painted it, sang it in ballrooms and church pews. But once love passed the threshold of marriage, it became a contract, and contracts, unlike hearts, were not meant to bend. The law stated plainly that husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. Elenina learned this not from argument or anger, but from the small, daily humiliations that came disguised as courtesy. When she expressed a wish to visit her sister in Bath, it required Thomas's written permission. When she purchased a set of watercolor brushes, the receipt bore his name. Even her correspondence, her private letters, could be opened by him without question. The law said he had a right to know her thoughts, because she, by definition, had none apart from his. He never abused that right. But he did not refuse it either. And that was the peculiar cruelty of it. The quiet, inescapable sense that love was not enough to make her free. One evening, as rain whispered against the window panes, as it often seemed to in their story, she found herself at his desk, idly leafing through the legal documents that cluttered it. Among them, folded and yellowing, was their marriage certificate. She read it again, tracing the lines with her fingertip. Her name, his, the witnesses, the date. It was a single sheet of paper, deceptively ordinary, yet it carried more power than any vow. "Do you ever think," she asked when he entered, "that marriage feels more like a transaction than a promise?" Thomas paused, his expression unreadable. "You speak as if they are not the same thing." "They shouldn't be," she said. "And yet here we are." He sighed. rubbing the back of his neck, an old habit from his army days. You know the law was not written by lovers. No, she said quietly. It was written by men who needed to be sure they could keep what they owned. The remark hung in the air like smoke, delicate, dangerous, undeniable. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Because she was right. Even he, fair and thoughtful as he tried to be, lived in a world that told him his ownership was natural. And yet, in that silence, something subtle shifted between them, a recognition not of rebellion, but of truth. He reached for her hand, hesitated, and then took it gently. Then let us make our own terms, he said at last. If the law insists we are one person, let that person be kinder than the law imagines. She smiled faintly, though her eyes did not soften. I'll hold you to that. And she did. Their marriage became a quiet act of negotiation, not between husband and wife, but between love and law. She learned to carve small spaces of freedom within the confines of her new name. A morning walk unaccompanied, a letter written in her own voice, a painting signed only with her initials. Little rebellions that the world would never notice but that mattered immensely to the one living them. Still, there were nights when she would wake and listen to the rhythm of his breathing beside her and feel both affection and ache. To love him was easy. To belong to him entirely was unbearable. She wondered how many women across England felt the same, lying in beds beside good men and dreaming not of romance, but of recognition. Outside, Parliament was beginning to stir with whispers of reform pamphlets and petitions calling for married women's property rights, for the restoration of their legal selves. It would take decades before those changes came, but Elena did not know that. To her, the fight was invisible, distant as the colonies he once spoke of. What she knew was the world within her home, the hush of domestic duty, the rituals of affection, the constant, quiet balancing act between love and self. Sometimes, she thought back to her father's house, the cold room where she once laced her corset and dreamed of escape. She had imagined that marriage would open a door, that it would give her a room of her own, a future unshadowed by parental control. Instead, it had given her a new kind of confinement, gilded by affection and reinforced by the law. But she was not entirely powerless. She discovered that even within ownership, there was influence the kind that moved not by command, but by grace. She learned to navigate her role as wife not by surrender, but by subtlety, to smile in ways that shifted his choices, to suggest ideas he believed were his own. The world had made her invisible. She, in turn, learned to haunt it quietly. It was said that the perfect Victorian marriage was built on obedience, yet, in truth, it survived on adaptation, on women like Elenina, who learned to bend without breaking. If you listen now, you can almost hear it, the sound of her pen scratching across paper in the lamplight, her thoughts disguised as pleasantries, her feelings translated into safe metaphors, her mind brilliant and caged, moving beneath the surface like a current beneath calm water. Love, in that era, was not rebellion. It was endurance, the art of existing within a structure designed to erase you and still leaving a trace. And so, Mrs. Thomas Weatherby, once Elenina Hartwell, lived her days as wife, hostess, confidante. The world called her fortunate. Few would ever know the quiet act of courage it took each morning to wake and remind herself that the woman beneath the name still lived. The law would not recognize her. History would not remember her. But every time she picked up her pen, or stood her ground with a smile, or turned silence into understanding, she rewrote the smallest corner of that law for herself. Perhaps that is what all Victorian wives did. In their own ways stitched rebellion into embroidery, hid intellect inside politeness, smuggled freedom into conversation over tea. Their lives were not stories of conquest, but of survival. And though the marriage certificate claimed them, their thoughts, their truest selves, slipped quietly between the lines, untamed and undefeated. The world believed she belonged to him, but in truth, she belonged only to her endurance and to the quiet, stubborn hope that one day, love might mean equality, not erasure. The morning of her wedding arrived not with celebration, but with stillness, a grayness that pressed against the windows and made every sound feel hushed, reverent, uncertain. London seemed to have wrapped itself in fog, as if reluctant to witness another woman vanish into marriage. Outside, the carriages waited like dark beetles on the cobblestone street, their brass fittings dulled by the mist. Inside, Elenina Hartwell stood before a mirror she barely recognized, surrounded by a flurry of lace, whispers, and pins. The white silk gown shimmered faintly in the lamplight, not quite radiant, not quite her. White was the fashion now, ever since the queen herself had chosen it, turning purity into spectacle. But to Elenina, the color felt less like innocence and more like surrender, a kind of ceremonial erasure. The dress was heavy, its train long enough to trip her if she forgot to walk carefully, its corset so tight that each breath sounded like an apology. Around her, the maids murmured about beauty and fortune, about how lucky she was to be chosen by a man like Mr. Weatherby, respectable, intelligent, stable. She nodded, smiled when expected, and tried not to look at herself too closely in the mirror, because the reflection staring back no longer looked like a person, but like an idea that someone else had dressed. Her mother fluttered about, rearranging ribbons, fussing over the veil. "You mustn't look so solemn, dear," she said, half whisper, half plea. "A wedding is a woman's happiest day." Elenina wanted to say that happiness felt like a poor word for what today was. It wasn't joy that filled her chest, but gravity, the sense that every step from now on would echo through the rest of her life. She wanted to tell her mother that she wasn't afraid of Thomas, but of vanishing into him, of becoming the softer shadow of his outline. But instead, she smiled again, because that was what brides did. When the carriage door closed, the city's murmur faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on stone. Her father sat beside her, his gloved hands folded neatly over his walking stick, saying nothing. Perhaps he was thinking of the expense, or the relief, or the quiet pride of seeing his daughter settled. Or perhaps, though she doubted it, he, too, felt the faint sting of loss. The world outside passed in shades of gray and gold, the fog breaking just enough to reveal the spires of the church ahead. Inside, the pews gleamed with beeswax polish, and the faint smell of lilies mixed with the sharper scent of rain-soaked wool. Guests murmured softly, their breath visible in the chill. When the organ began to play, a tremor ran through the congregation, that instinctive tightening that accompanies ceremony, when people remember they are witnessing something both ordinary and sacred. Then she began to walk. Each step echoed down the stone aisle, slow and measured, the silk whispering like distant waves. Her father's arm was firm beneath her hand, guiding, steady, final. Faces turned as she passed cousins, family, friends, half-familiar acquaintances, their smiles painted with the satisfaction of propriety fulfilled. The women assessed her dress. The men admired the solemnity of the groom. No one saw the small tremor in her jaw, or the way her breath caught at the end of each exhale. Thomas waited at the altar, tall and still, his dark coat immaculate, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He looked as though he belonged to the age of iron and empire, precise, polished, contained. Yet when their eyes met, for the briefest second, something flickered between them, a memory of rain, of courage, of the soft defiance of two people who once spoke honestly in the dark. Then the moment passed. The priest began the service, his voice steady, practiced, and ancient. The words had been said so many times they had worn grooves into history. Dearly beloved, the air seemed to thicken with ritual. Every phrase, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, to obey, sounded like both a promise and a warning. When her turn came to speak, her voice faltered once, just barely, but enough for her to feel the weight of 100 eyes. She recovered, smiling faintly, the sound of her own "I do" more fragile than she expected. The ring was slipped onto her finger, gold, perfect, binding, and with it came a strange finality. The quiet closing of a door behind her. There was a kiss, soft and formal, and applause that echoed briefly through the nave before dying into murmurs. The congregation rose as they turned to walk back down the aisle. Husband and wife now, the transformation complete. Outside, the light had changed. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a sky neither blue nor gray, but something in between the color of resignation. The carriages lined up once more, horses stamping, breath steaming. Someone threw petals, though most of them landed wet and limp upon the cobblestones. Elenina's new name was already being spoken aloud, Mrs. Weatherby, with its foreign weight and practiced elegance. Each time she heard it, it sounded less like her. It would take years before she would learn to turn her head instinctively when called. At the reception, everything gleamed. The silverware, the laughter, the sheen of champagne in tall glasses. The guests toasted to love, to health, to the Weatherbys' long and happy life together. Elenina smiled when cued, moved through the crowd like a porcelain figurine animated by courtesy. The words people spoke to her all sounded the same, compliments varnished with envy or politeness. But beneath the chatter, her mind wandered. She thought of the morning light in her old room, of her books, her sketches, the small comfort of being alone with her thoughts. She wondered what had become of them, whether her mother had packed them neatly or left them behind. She thought of her name again, of how it had fit her once, light as breath, and how it now felt like something she had outgrown. Later, when the crowd thinned and the candles burned low, she slipped outside for a moment's air. The churchyard smelled faintly of wet stone and roses. Her veil fluttered softly in the wind, catching droplets of mist. Through the open window behind her, she could hear laughter, his laughter low, easy, familiar already. And though she loved him, truly, she felt an ache she could not name. It was not regret, but awareness, the recognition that love had boundaries drawn by law, by language, by history itself. That today, while gaining one life, she had buried another. When Thomas joined her, he found her gazing upward, eyes reflecting the pale sky. "You're cold," he said softly, placing his coat over her shoulders. "A little," she admitted. "You'll grow used to it," he said, misunderstanding. She smiled faintly. "Yes," she murmured. "I expect I will." He took her hand then, and though it warmed beneath his, the weight of the ring pressed cold against her skin. Somewhere behind them, the bells began to ring again, bright and insistent, their sound carrying across the rooftops and down the damp London streets. It was supposed to be a song of joy, of union. To Elenina, it sounded more like farewell. If you were to stand there now, years later, in that same churchyard, you might still feel it, the trace of that morning's quiet gravity, the lingering scent of lilies and rain. The white silk, long turned to dust, would still whisper faintly through time. Here walked a woman who learned that purity was a costume and love, a ceremony written by men. The history books would not mention her, of course. They would note only the marriage, the alliance of two respectable families, the date recorded neatly in parish ledgers. But in the invisible margins of history, there would remain a moment. A bride standing beneath a gray sky, realizing that even as the world congratulated her, she was gently, irreversibly disappearing. And yet, within that vanishing, something endured, the faint, stubborn flicker of self that no law, no name, no ceremony could extinguish. Perhaps that is what all brides carried in that age, hidden beneath the lace and vows, the quiet promise that even in surrender they would not be entirely erased. For Elenina, that flicker would remain not loud enough to defy the world, but steady enough to survive it. And though the records would show that Miss Hartwell became Mrs. Weatherby on that damp London morning, the truth, known only to her, was simpler and stronger. She never stopped being herself. She merely learned to live as a ghost within her own story, haunting it with grace. The first weeks of marriage were not what novels promised. There were no eternal sighs, no moonlit confessions, no sudden transformations of two strangers into one harmonious soul. Instead, there was adjustment, awkward, tender, and often silent. The honeymoon, if one could call it that, was a lesson in proximity. Two people who had once spoken only in measured tones and under watchful eyes now shared the same air, the same bed, the same slow rhythm of domestic life. For Elena, the first morning as Mrs. Weatherby began not with romance, but with confusion, a moment of waking and not immediately recognizing the room, the bed, or even the faint warmth beside her. The curtains filtered a weak gray light. Somewhere downstairs, the servants whispered and the kettle began to sing. She lay still, her hand resting just inches from his on the coverlet, the air between them thick with the quiet weight of newness. Marriage, she realized, was not the grand ending everyone spoke of, but another beginning one with fewer witnesses and more uncertainty. Thomas stirred, mumbled something about the hour, and rose first, the floorboards creaking beneath his steps. He moved with habitual precision, as though the military still guided his mornings. She watched him from the bed, the outline of his figure partly obscured by the curtain's soft glow. There was something both intimate and distant in seeing him like this, the domestic version of a man who had, until now, existed only in formal rooms, pressed coats, and polite conversation. Their first breakfast as husband and wife was eaten in near silence. The toast burned, the eggs cooled, and both pretended not to notice. He read the paper, or at least looked at it. She stirred her tea without drinking. The table between them felt vast, not in space, but in unfamiliarity. Yet, beneath the stillness, a fragile sort of tenderness was forming, quiet and unspoken, like a melody only they could hear. Over the next weeks, they learned each other the way one learns a new instrument, clumsily at first, then with growing ease. He discovered that she could not abide the smell of cigar smoke indoors. She learned that he preferred his books arranged by color rather than subject, an order that made no sense but pleased him greatly. He took his tea black, she with too much sugar. She wrote letters in the morning when he worked, and he joined her by the fire in the evening, reading aloud from the papers or, when the mood softened, from poetry. There were quarrels too, small and fleeting, over unwatered ferns, over forgotten appointments, over the invisible boundaries of shared life. Yet even their disagreement seemed to shape them closer together, like iron hammered into form. For every word spoken too sharply, there came another spoken gently, an apology disguised as a remark, a peace offering in the form of laughter. It was during illness that affection truly took root. That winter, Thomas caught a fever, the kind that burned hot and sudden. For 3 nights she barely slept, tending to him in the flickering light of a single candle. She bathed his forehead, coaxed him to drink water, and listened as he muttered fevered fragments of memory, names of places, commands, apologies. She understood then the ghosts that followed him from India, the heat and loneliness he carried even in England's cold air. When he recovered, he thanked her not with words but with a look, one of those quiet acknowledgments that changed the nature of things between them. And she, too, had her frailties. There were days when her loneliness pressed against her ribs like an illness, when the house seemed too large and the silence too deep. Thomas, for all his decency, did not always know how to meet her in that silence. He would attempt conversation about trade, or the weather, or the latest parliamentary debates, unaware that she wanted not talk but company, a shared stillness, a sense that she was seen. Yet in time, he learned. There were evenings when he would sit beside her without a word, their chairs angled toward the fire, the light dancing across their faces. In those quiet intervals, they spoke more deeply than speech allowed. Affection, for them, grew not from passion but from patience. The Victorians did not believe in grand gestures. They believed in constancy. Love was not declared. It was demonstrated in the turning down of a lamp, the folding of a shawl, the gentle refusal to leave when words failed. Each act of care repeated enough times, became a kind of devotion. Elenina found that she loved the sound of his footsteps approaching down the hall, the soft, measured rhythm that marked the end of his day. She loved the way he read aloud, without noticing how his voice softened at the end of certain lines. She loved, too, the imperfections, the occasional clumsiness of his hands, the way his hair refused to stay orderly, no matter how carefully it was combed. These were not the things girls dreamed of before marriage, but they were the things that made marriage bearable, perhaps even beautiful. For his part, Thomas came to depend on her more than he had expected. Her presence steadied him, like the scent of home carried on a traveler's clothes. When she sat by the window in the late afternoon light, writing her letters, he often found himself pausing just to look not out of possession, but gratitude. She brought warmth into the house, not by doing anything extraordinary, but simply by existing there, quietly and persistently, like a lamp that refused to go out. There were moments of laughter too, though neither would have called them such. Shared smiles over burnt toast, the startled giggle when a book fell from the shelf and narrowly missed his head, the absurdity of small domestic failures. These fragments stitched their lives together more securely than vows. And then there were the silences, not the heavy ones, but the peaceful kind, when two people no longer needed to fill the air to prove their affection. Sometimes, in those quiet hours between supper and sleep, Elenina would sit at the piano, her fingers tracing simple melodies. Thomas would stand by the fireplace, his gaze lost in the flames. Between them, without touching, there was a profound sense of belonging, two strangers who had chosen, through sheer persistence, to become known to each other. Society expected their union to be orderly, respectable, and productive. But inside the walls of their home, something softer unfolded, something that defied the rigid choreography of Victorian propriety. They were not lovers in the dramatic sense. They were companions, co-conspirators in the long endurance of life. Years later, when asked by a friend if she was happy, Elenina had paused before answering. Happiness, she thought, was too bright a word for what she felt, but contentment, quiet, steady, human, yes, that she knew. There was a comfort in their shared routines, in knowing when he would reach for his tea, when he would sigh at the evening paper, when his hand would find hers without needing to look. If you listen closely, you might still hear them, the sound of two lives, learning each other's rhythm, the murmur of pages turning, the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. This was love in its truest Victorian form, not a fever, but a slow, enduring warmth, not an explosion, but a steady burn. And perhaps that was the secret of their marriage, the understanding that tenderness does not announce itself. It grows quietly, between the moments, shaping two people not into one, but into something gentler, more resilient. In the end, their affection became the kind that could weather silence, misunderstanding, even sorrow, because it was built not on grand declarations, but on the simple, daily act of staying. And if you're still awake, you might think of them now, a man and a woman in a candlelit room, learning to breathe together in the rhythm of shared life. The toast still burns, the books still fall, and the love, awkward and human, continues patient, imperfect, and real. The first weeks of marriage were not what novels promised. There were no eternal sighs, no moonlit confessions, no sudden transformations of two strangers into one harmonious soul. Instead, there was adjustment, awkward, tender, and often silent. The honeymoon, if one could call it that, was a lesson in proximity. Two people who had once spoken only in measured tones and under watchful eyes now shared the same air, the same bed, the same slow rhythm of domestic life. For Elenina, the first morning as Mrs. Weatherby began not with romance, but with confusion, a moment of waking and not immediately recognizing the room, the bed, or even the faint warmth beside her. The curtains filtered a weak gray light. Somewhere downstairs, the servants whispered and the kettle began to sing. She lay still, her hand resting just inches from his on the coverlet. The air between them, thick with the quiet weight of newness. Marriage, she realized, was not the grand ending everyone spoke of, but another beginning one with fewer witnesses and more uncertainty. Thomas stirred, mumbled something about the hour, and rose first, the floorboards creaking beneath his steps. He moved with habitual precision, as though the military still guided his mornings. She watched him from the bed, the outline of his figure partly obscured by the curtain's soft glow. There was something both intimate and distant in seeing him like this, the domestic version of a man who had, until now, existed only in formal rooms, pressed coats, and polite conversation. Their first breakfast as husband and wife was eaten in near silence. The toast burned, the eggs cooled, and both pretended not to notice. He read the paper, or at least looked at it. She stirred her tea without drinking. The table between them felt vast, not in space, but in unfamiliarity. Yet, beneath the stillness, a fragile sort of tenderness was forming, quiet and unspoken, like a melody only they could hear. Over the next weeks, they learned each other the way one learns a new instrument, clumsily at first, then with growing ease. He discovered that she could not abide the smell of cigar smoke indoors. She learned that he preferred his books arranged by color rather than subject, an order that made no sense but pleased him greatly. He took his tea black, she with too much sugar. She wrote letters in the morning when he worked, and he joined her by the fire in the evening, reading aloud from the papers or, when the mood softened, from poetry. There were quarrels too, small and fleeting, over unwatered ferns, over forgotten appointments, over the invisible boundaries of shared life. Yet even their disagreement seemed to shape them closer together, like iron hammered into form. For every word spoken too sharply, there came another spoken gently, an apology disguised as a remark, a peace offering in the form of laughter. It was during illness that affection truly took root. That winter, Thomas caught a fever, the kind that burned hot and sudden. For 3 nights she barely slept, tending to him in the flickering light of a single candle. She bathed his forehead, coaxed him to drink water, and listened as he muttered fevered fragments of memory, names of places, commands, apologies. She understood then the ghosts that followed him from India, the heat and loneliness he carried even in England's cold air. When he recovered, he thanked her not with words but with a look, one of those quiet acknowledgments that changed the nature of things between them. And she, too, had her frailties. There were days when her loneliness pressed against her ribs like an illness, when the house seemed too large and the silence too deep. Thomas, for all his decency, did not always know how to meet her in that silence. He would attempt conversation about trade, or the weather, or the latest parliamentary debates, unaware that she wanted not talk but company, a shared stillness, a sense that she was seen. Yet in time, he learned. There were evenings when he would sit beside her without a word, their chairs angled toward the fire, the light dancing across their faces. In those quiet intervals, they spoke more deeply than speech allowed. Affection, for them, grew not from passion but from patience. The Victorians did not believe in grand gestures. They believed in constancy. Love was not declared. It was demonstrated in the turning down of a lamp, the folding of a shawl, the gentle refusal to leave when words failed. Each act of care, repeated enough times, became a kind of devotion. Eleanor found that she loved the sound of his footsteps approaching down the hall, the soft, measured rhythm that marked the end of his day. She loved the way he read aloud, without noticing how his voice softened at the end of certain lines. She loved, too, the imperfections, the occasional clumsiness of his hands, the way his hair refused to stay orderly, no matter how carefully it was combed. These were not the things girls dreamed of before marriage, but they were the things that made marriage bearable, perhaps even beautiful. For his part, Thomas came to depend on her more than he had expected. Her presence steadied him, like the scent of home carried on a traveler's clothes. When she sat by the window in the late afternoon light, writing her letters, he often found himself pausing just to look not out of possession, but gratitude. She brought warmth into the house, not by doing anything extraordinary, but simply by existing there, quietly and persistently, like a lamp that refused to go out. There were moments of laughter too, though neither would have called them such. Shared smiles over burnt toast, the startled giggle when a book fell from the shelf and narrowly missed his head, the absurdity of small domestic failures. These fragments stitched their lives together more securely than vows. And then there were the silences, not the heavy ones, but the peaceful kind, when two people no longer needed to fill the air to prove their affection. Sometimes, in those quiet hours between supper and sleep, Elenina would sit at the piano, her fingers tracing simple melodies. Thomas would stand by the fireplace, his gaze lost in the flames. Between them, without touching, there was a profound sense of belonging, two strangers who had chosen, through sheer persistence, to become known to each other. Society expected their union to be orderly, respectable, and productive. But inside the walls of their home, something softer unfolded, something that defied the rigid choreography of Victorian propriety. They were not lovers in the dramatic sense. They were companions, co-conspirators in the long endurance of life. Years later, when asked by a friend if she was happy, Elenina had paused before answering. Happiness, she thought, was too bright a word for what she felt, but contentment, quiet, steady, human, yes, that she knew. There was a comfort in their shared routines, in knowing when he would reach for his tea, when he would sigh at the evening paper, when his hand would find hers without needing to look. If you listen closely, you might still hear them, the sound of two lives, learning each other's rhythm, the murmur of pages turning, the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. This was love in its truest Victorian form. Not a fever, but a slow, enduring warmth. Not an explosion, but a steady burn. And perhaps that was the secret of their marriage, the understanding that tenderness does not announce itself. It grows quietly, between the moments, shaping two people not into one, but into something gentler, more resilient. In the end, their affection became the kind that could weather silence, misunderstanding, even sorrow, because it was built not on grand declarations, but on the simple, daily act of staying. And if you're still awake, you might think of them now, a man and a woman in a candlelit room, learning to breathe together in the rhythm of shared life. The toast still burns, the books still fall, and the love, awkward and human, continues patient, imperfect, and real. The years moved quietly, as they always do when one is too busy living to notice them passing. The Weatherby's house in Kensington stood tall and modest, its brick facade warmed by soot and sunlight, its windows framed with ivy that crept steadily upward, season after season. Inside, the rooms filled gradually, not with riches or grandeur, but with life. 3 children, the ticking of clocks, the faint smell of bread cooling on the table, and the constant undercurrent of ink and fire. Love, once fragile and hesitant, had settled here not as passion or spectacle, but as rhythm. Theirs was the kind of affection that had stopped asking to be noticed. It simply was, woven into the grain of the furniture, the hum of the fireplace, the scuffed floors that remembered the chaos of little feet. Thomas aged in quiet dignity, his shoulders a touch stooped from years of writing at his desk, his hands ink-stained and sure. He had left behind the restless ambitions of his youth, finding peace in the slow, deliberate world of routine. Each morning he rose early, as he always had, the scrape of his chair on the floor announcing the start of another day. He read the paper, marked a few lines, and took his tea beside the window, the same way he had done for years. Some mornings he read aloud to Elenina, though more often than not she only half listened, smiling at the familiar cadence of his voice. She had changed, too, though less visibly. The bloom of youth had softened into something deeper, not beauty, but presence. Her hair was tied simply now, streaked faintly with gray that she made no effort to hide. Her hands were rougher from work, her eyes more thoughtful from watching over so many small, fragile lives. Yet there was a grace in her stillness, the quiet confidence of someone who had learned not just to endure the world, but to live inside it. Their children were the soundtrack of those years' laughter spilling through doorways, the thud of wooden toys, the occasional cry that sent one or both parents rushing to soothe. The eldest, Henry, had inherited his father's patience and his mother's curious mind. The middle child, Clara, her mother's gentleness and stubborn streak, and the youngest, little James, who had yet to learn the meaning of silence. Evenings were their truest hours. The lamps lit one by one, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the rooms glowed with the warm exhaustion of a day well spent. Dinner was never grand, but it was always shared stew in thick bowls, bread still warm, sometimes an apple tart when Elenina had found a moment to bake. They spoke in the shorthand that long companionship allows, glances, nods, unfinished sentences that the other completed without thinking. After the children were tucked away, one asleep, one pretending not to be, and one snoring proudly, the house fell into its nightly hush. Thomas would sit at his desk, writing letters or notes for his lectures. Elenina, by the fire, mended clothes or read by lamplight. Sometimes she would look up and catch him watching her, that same unreadable half smile on his face. "What?" she would ask, without lifting her head fully. "Nothing," he'd say. "Just thinking how much quieter the world becomes when you're near." She'd roll her eyes, but she'd smile all the same. It wasn't passion, not anymore, but something sturdier. Their love had matured the way iron cools into strength, slow, steady, unshowy. They no longer needed to prove it with words or gestures. It lived in the space between them, as constant as the ticking clock in the hall. Outside their home, the world was changing faster than they could follow. Railways stretched like veins across the country. Factories smoked. Fortunes rose and fell. In the papers, Thomas read about revolutions, inventions, and moral debates that seemed to reshape the very air of London. But inside their small corner of Kensington, life remained rhythmical, predictable, a steady pulse amid the noise of progress. Sometimes Elenina wondered if the world outside envied or pitied them, two people who had built their entire existence around domestic repetition. But when she looked at her children asleep beside the fire on winter nights, she felt no regret. There was meaning, she thought, in the smallness of ordinary life and the warmth of it, the repetition that made it safe. On Sundays, they walked to church as a family, the children holding on to gloved hands, their breath clouding the cold air. The bells always sounded too loud for the quiet street, but Elenina liked them. They reminded her that life was both routine and miraculous, both fleeting and endless. After service, they would stroll through the park, their youngest chasing pigeons, while the older two quarreled about who got to hold the biscuit tin. And in those moments, amid the noise, the laughter, the mild chaos, she often felt something close to peace. There were harder years, too, though they rarely spoke of them. Times when money was tight, when illness swept through the house, when exhaustion sank so deep that even kindness became an effort. Yet through all of it, their love endured not because it was perfect, but because it was practiced. They had learned over the years how to forgive without ceremony, how to comfort without words. One winter, when the youngest boy fell ill and the doctor's visits grew too frequent, Elenina sat by the child's bedside night after night. Thomas, worn and anxious, would find her there at dawn, her face pale from sleeplessness, her hand still resting on the boy's arm. He never told her to rest. He simply brought her tea, kissed her forehead, and sat beside her. It was not grand romance, it was partnership, the quiet kind forged through shared fatigue. And when the boy recovered, the house seemed to breathe again, lighter, warmer, filled with gratitude that had no need for speech. In spring, the windows opened once more, and sunlight returned to the house like an old friend. The children grew taller, louder, and more independent. The parents grew older, slower, and more reflective. The house, once so full of uncertainty, now felt like an extension of their hearts, the ticking clocks, their pulse, the fire, their endurance, the sound of laughter, their reward. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the world outside faded into mist, Elena would sit by the fire and think of who she had been before the girl in the corset, the bride beneath the gray sky, the woman who thought love was something one fell into. Now she knew better. Love, she realized, was not a fall but a craft, something built, mended, and tended daily like a hearth that must never go out. Thomas would join her, carrying his cup of tea, setting it down beside hers. They would talk of small things, the weather, the neighbors, the price of coal, and sometimes they would not talk at all. The silence was no longer awkward. It was comfort. When their eldest son left for university, Elena stood in the doorway long after the carriage disappeared, the younger two clinging to her skirt. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into it not in sadness, but in understanding. They had built something together, she thought, something that would outlive even them. A home, a lineage, a quiet continuity. Years later, when her hair turned silver and her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, she found herself smiling more often than she used to. The mirror showed lines on her face that spoke not of loss, but of life, of laughter, of worry, of love that had endured the slow erosion of time. Thomas still read by the fire every evening, glasses perched low on his nose. Sometimes he fell asleep mid-sentence, and she would gently remove the book from his hand, mark the page, and set it aside. Then she would watch him for a while, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of the fire painting his face. This, she thought, was love, not the feverish kind that burned and faded, but the enduring kind that stayed warm even when the flames grew low. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint ticking of the clock, the crackle of the hearth, the quiet murmur of two lives grown together. Not extraordinary, not tragic, simply human. And in that ordinariness lay its beauty, the kind that history never writes about, but that keeps the world turning all the same. Their love no longer needed to be declared. It lived in the steady beat of time itself, in the warmth of the hearth, in the laughter of their children, in the small, shared silence of a life well weathered together. By the time the years had softened into habit and the sharp edge of youth had dulled into calm, their love had transformed into something so subtle, so constant, that even they sometimes forgot to name it. The fever of first glances and trembling hands was long gone, replaced by something quieter, a kind of devotion that lived between gestures, beneath words, under the hush of daily ritual. It was not passion, though passion had once passed through their lives like a summer storm. It was patience, the kind that required endurance, not excitement, the kind that grew roots instead of wings. The world around them, as Victorian as ever, still demanded restraint. Curtains were drawn early, emotions folded away like fine linen. Politeness governed everything from grief to affection. And yet, within those narrow boundaries, Thomas and Elena discovered a kind of freedom that only those who had survived long love could understand. They had learned that the truest rebellion in an age obsessed with propriety was not to defy its rules loudly, but to find tenderness within them, to turn duty into intimacy, formality into familiarity, and silence into a language of their own. In their home, affection was rarely spoken aloud, but always understood. It lived in the small, invisible exchanges of a shared life. The cup of tea poured before it was asked for, the hand that lingered an extra second when passing the bread, the quiet awareness of each other's breathing in the dark. A single touch beneath the dinner table, brief, deliberate, hidden from the children's view, could carry more meaning than a page of love poetry. It was easy, from the outside, to mistake their marriage for stillness, but it was a stillness that moved, like a clock's pendulum, steady and exact. Their love had rhythm, even if it never shouted for attention. They no longer sought grand declarations. They sought understanding. They had stopped needing to convince the world that they belonged to each other. They simply did. Victorian society, so fond of appearances, had always imagined love as spectacle: the ballrooms, the bouquets, the whispered gossip about who danced twice with whom. But the Weatherbys knew that real love could not survive under the chandeliers. It grew instead in the quiet hours, the ones no one wrote about, the gray mornings when rain blurred the windows, the long evenings by the fire when neither spoke, yet both felt entirely accompanied. Sometimes, in those moments, Elena would think back to the girl she once was, the one who had measured happiness by corsets, courtship, and approval. That girl had believed love was something to be achieved, a performance to be perfected. But now she knew better. Love was not a reward for beauty or virtue. It was a discipline, an act of tending, of returning, of refusing to turn away even when the flame flickered low. Thomas, too, had changed. The restless soldier's son, who once sought purpose in faraway colonies, had found it instead in the patience of shared existence. His letters now were written not to impress, but to remember. Notes about the garden, the children, the strange bird that nested near the eaves. His words, once full of certainty, now carried humility, a soft recognition of how little a man could control, and how much he could still care for. Their love had no audience, no applause, and yet, in its quiet persistence, it seemed to defy the very order of their age. For while the world around them exalted propriety, they had discovered something almost radical: that affection need not be loud to be lasting, and that a marriage could hold both obedience and freedom as long as kindness endured between them. In the evenings, when the lamps were dimmed and the children gone to their own lives, they would sit together before the hearth. The fire had grown smaller over the years, but its glow was warmer, its crackle familiar, like an old friend's voice. Thomas would sometimes take up his pen, sometimes doze, his head bowed slightly as if in prayer. Elenina would read, her fingers tracing the margins of the same book she had read a dozen times before. They did not need to speak. The silence between them was full, not empty, but whole, like the pause in music that gives the notes their meaning. When their hands met not by chance, but by instinct, it was not a gesture of passion, but of proof. We are still here. There had been storms, of course, griefs, illnesses, and the long loneliness that sometimes slips even into happy homes. They had faced years when conversation became a matter of logistics rather than intimacy, when fatigue made tempers short and compassion harder to reach. But through all of it, they had chosen each other, again and again, quietly and without ceremony. That, she thought, was what love truly meant, not the first yes at the altar, but the 1,000 small yeses that followed. If passion is a flame, patience is the hearth, and the Weatherbys had built theirs strong enough to outlast the wind. Their children, now grown, often joked that their parents were the calmest couple in London. "You never argue," Henry once said with affectionate disbelief. Elenina smiled, glancing at her husband. "We argued plenty," she said. "We just learned to argue softly, as two." For that was the truth of their endurance. They had learned softness in a world that prized hardness, compromise in an age that worshipped certainty. They had discovered that affection was not a single grand feeling, but a practice one made up of shared patience, forgiveness, and the unspoken decision to keep showing up. In this way, their marriage became something like art, a quiet, continuous creation, imperfect and human. Every crease in their faces, every scar of misunderstanding, every laugh earned through fatigue was part of its beauty. Love had become less about the rush of emotion and more about the gentle dignity of staying. On their 25th anniversary, they took a walk through Hyde Park. The day was soft and silver, the air tinged with the faint smell of damp grass. They said little, watching the ducks on the Serpentine, the carriages passing, the children flying kites that dipped and trembled against the clouds. "It's strange," she said at last, "how long a life can feel, and how quickly it goes." He smiled. "Like tea left too long to steep," he said. "You only notice the strength once it cools." She laughed then, softly, as the wind caught her veil of gray hair. They stood in silence a moment longer. Her arm looped through his, both looking at the water, its surface rippled but unbroken, its depth invisible and certain. That was their love now. No longer a flame, but a current unseen, continuous, and calm. It did not need tending every hour. It sustained itself through the sheer familiarity of two souls that had long since learned each other's weight. And when they returned home that evening, the lamps glowing in their windows like small suns, Elenina paused on the doorstep. "We've done rather well," she said quietly, her tone neither proud nor wistful, but matter-of-fact, the way one speaks of something hard-earned and simple. Thomas turned the key and smiled. "We've kept the fire," he said, and inside, as the clock chimed softly and the world beyond their door receded into the London mist, the old rhythm of their lives resumed. The murmur of voices, the faint clatter of cups, the warmth that had never left. In the end, theirs was not the kind of love that made history, but the kind that made life bearable. Not passion, but persistence. Not rebellion, but resilience. In a world laced with lace and silence, they had found a quiet kind of freedom, the kind that blooms not in defiance, but in endurance. And if you listen, somewhere in the gentle turning of time, you can still hear them, two steady hearts, beating softly together in the long, patient hush of Victorian love. In the end, Victorian romance was never about passion in the way we imagine it. It was about survival within structure, tenderness practiced under pressure. Love existed between the rules, not beyond them. It lived in the pauses between sentences, in the soft brush of gloved fingers, in the careful wording of a letter that could never quite say what it meant. Every sigh had to be hidden beneath propriety, every feeling disguised as etiquette. And yet, somehow, it endured. For all the corsets, chaperones, and moral sermons, people still found ways to fall for one another, not through rebellion, but through quiet persistence. If we look at those black and white portraits today, it's easy to mistake the still faces for lifeless ones. But behind each photograph was motion, a heartbeat held still for the camera's long exposure. Those women in lace were not symbols of repression. They were survivors of decorum, balancing desire and duty like dancers on a glass floor. Those men in waistcoats and solemn poses were not strangers to affection. They simply lived in a world that told them to hide it. Every love story of that era was an act of subtle rebellion, a quiet defiance of silence itself. And perhaps that's why these stories still draw us in. We live in a time of immediacy, of messages that vanish in seconds, of hearts that open and close at the swipe of a thumb, and yet we find ourselves romanticizing an age of waiting, of letters carried across oceans, of glances stolen in candlelight, of love built not on urgency but endurance. There is a strange elegance in their restraint, a kind of bravery in how they manage to feel deeply while appearing composed. To love under surveillance, that was the art of the Victorians. Behind every preserved letter in a museum lies a heartbeat, faint but stubborn, reminding us that love, in any century, is a form of courage. Courage to feel when feeling is unfashionable. Courage to care when the world insists on convenience. And courage, most of all, to wait not for perfection, but for persistence. Now the fire burns low. The room grows dim, its warmth fading into memory. Two empty teacups sit on the table, their rims faintly stained with stories. A pair of gloves rests beside a folded letter, one that was written but never sent. Words of affection trapped forever in their neat blue ink. Outside, London exhales its familiar fog, wrapping the gas lamps in a silver haze. Somewhere out there, the ghosts of those long-ago lovers still walk unseen, unhurried, their whispers trailing softly through the mist. And here you are, centuries later, listening. One heart beating now, another then, joined across the years by the same quiet rhythm, proof that time may change the world, but not the pulse of longing. If you're still awake, thank you for courting the past with me. Like, share, and subscribe. And may your dreams tonight be gentle, polite, and blissfully scandal-free.